What if history class left out the body count? Forget the sanitized timelines and noble speeches. This is the side of history written in blood, buried in footnotes, and quietly erased with a royal wink. From ritual murder to state-sponsored starvation, these are the 99 facts they don't carve into marble. Not because they're false, because they're true, and too disturbing to remember. You're not here for comfort. You're here for the things we tried to forget. So buckle in, light off, curtain up. This is 99 disturbing historical facts that you never heard about and your textbooks are about to catch fire. Before we plunge into the abyss, quick question. Where in the world are you watching from? And what ungodly hour is it where you are? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Either way, you're exactly where you belong. If unraveling the darker threads of history is your kind of insomnia cure, make sure you hit subscribe because we go deep, often, and unapologetically. Welcome to the late-night corner of the past they don't dare teach. Ancient Sumer, c. 2500 BC. Retainer sacrifice in the royal tombs of Ur. Ancient Sumer cradle of civilization, birthplace of writing, and, naturally, an early adopter of group death as a retirement plan. Buried beneath the sands of what is now Iraq lies the royal cemetery of Ur, where archaeologists stumbled upon what looked like a particularly well-attended slumber party. Dozens of skeletons, guards, musicians, servants, arranged in neat little rows beside their monarchs, not dead of old age. No, they were ritually killed. Likely drugged, then bludgeoned or poisoned, in order to serve their royal bosses in the afterlife. Because in Sumer, job security meant something very different. And we thought unpaid internships were bad. The whole thing was considered an honor, a kind of metaphysical LinkedIn endorsement. You were so good at pouring wine that the queen simply couldn't go into the void without you. Picture a king nervously wondering if his afterlife will be underwhelming, unless Dave the lyre player tags along. And this wasn't a one-time thing, this was systemic, organized, even stylish. They found gold, lapis lazuli, and battle carts, all arranged for the big sleepover in eternity. So if you ever feel like your boss is a bit clingy, be grateful they don't want you dead and embalmed next to them. Meanwhile, in Assyria, they took employee motivation to another level, one where blood, skin, and walls had a much too intimate relationship. Ancient Assyria, c. 9th, 7th century BC. Imperial brutality as public art. Welcome to ancient Assyria, where overachievement met sadism in high relief, literally. The Assyrian kings weren't just brutal, they were performance artists of carnage. Take Ashurnasirpal II. For instance, not content with merely winning battles, he had the flayed skins of enemy kings nailed to the walls of his palace like morbid wallpaper. Imagine entering a royal chamber and being greeted by what can only be described as flesh-based interior design. The Assyrians documented their massacres with such fanatical detail, you'd think they were making snuff documentaries in stone. Massive palace walls were carved with intricate depictions of heads on spikes, towers of corpses, and impaled prisoners writhing for eternity in cuneiform clarity. One inscription helpfully brags, "I cut off their heads and formed them into pillars. That's not war, that's scrapbooking with human remains." And it wasn't just enemies. Assyrian kings treated their own people like hostages in a domestic horror film. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of policy, it was policy. Rulers wrote about it, carved it into walls, and celebrated it like modern regimes might tout GDP growth. And just in case the flaying and impaling didn't deliver enough horror, let's take a trip down the Nile to watch an entire nation get gaslit by one of its own gods on earth. Ancient Egypt, c. 13th century BC. Akenatans' monotheistic purge. Meet Akenatan Pharaoh, sun god enthusiast, and Egypt's most theologically aggressive interior decorator. He didn't just start a new religion, he tried to erase every other god from existence. Temples to Amun, Osiris, Ra, smashed, statues, defaced, priests, defunded, all in favor of a single solar disk called Aten, a celestial circle so compelling, apparently, that it demanded the cultural equivalent of a religious nuclear strike. This wasn't a smooth rebranding, it was a purge with a marketing campaign. Akhenaten moved the capital to a brand new city, told the priesthood to get bent, and had his own name scrubbed into the stone like a pop star hijacking a band tour. Forget polytheism. Egypt was now a one-god town, and Aten had a monopoly on miracles. Of course, it didn't last. After Akhenaten's death, the old gods came storming back like they'd just been on a forced sabbatical. Temples were rebuilt, his name was chiseled out of monuments, and his new city was left to rot. His religious revolution turned into ancient Egypt's greatest divine faceplant. But as for suppressing belief systems, well, Akhenaten was just getting warmed up. The Greeks? They'd take suppression one step further by pretending neutrality before absolutely wrecking everyone. Ancient Greece, c. 5th century BC. The Melian massacre and the myth of Athenian morality. Ah, Athens, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and a disturbing knack for PR spin. You've heard of Socrates, Plato, and the high-minded ideals of civic virtue? Good. Now meet the Athenians during the Peloponnesian War, where all that moral clarity took a brief hiatus to allow for some old-fashioned genocide. In 416 BC, the small island of Melos made the fatal mistake of wanting to stay neutral in the war between Athens and Sparta. Athenian diplomats showed up and said, more or less, submit or die. The Melians said, we believe in hope, the gods, and honor. Athens said, cool. We'll kill all your men and sell your women and children into slavery. Which they did. Thoroughly. Thucydides, bless him, transcribed the whole pre-slaughter debate like a Socratic dialogue only this time. Instead of logical enlightenment, it ends with mass murder. The Athenians argued, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. It's like Nietzsche, but with spears and no punchlines. So much for the golden age of reason. And if you think that's ruthless, just wait until we arrive in Rome, where politicians didn't even pretend to negotiate before sending your name to the murder list. Ancient Rome, c. 1st century BC. Proscription and the death of civility. The Roman Republic loved order. It also loved loopholes. So when civil war broke out and enemies of the state needed removing, the elite didn't bother with trials, they just hung up a list. A proscription list, to be precise. It was like a civic murder leaderboard, except getting on it meant your property was seized, your head was fair game, and your family was encouraged to grieve discreetly, preferably while broke and in exile. Lucius Cornelius Sulla perfected the technique, putting hundreds of names on the list. And not just political rivals, anyone with enough land to be worth stealing. Kill a proscripted man, and you got a bonus. Turn in his friends? Even better. This was wealth redistribution by way of manhunt. Julius Caesar eventually abolished proscriptions, until Mark Antony and Octavian brought them back like a violent sequel nobody wanted. Not even Cicero, Rome's great orator, was spared. He tried to hide. They found him. He got the full head-in-hand special, nailed up in the forum like a warning sign written in flesh. Turns out the Republic wasn't so much falling as it was eating itself. But in the East, another empire was taking notes where control wasn't about killing opponents, but about erasing their thoughts altogether. Ancient China, c. 210 BC. Qin Shi Huang and the Bonfire of the Books. In theory, Qin Shi Huang unified China. In practice, he scorched its intellectual landscape and buried dissent with such gusto, it makes Orwell look quaint. Upon declaring himself the first emperor, Qin decided that history, philosophy, and independent thought were getting in the way of absolute power. His solution? Burn every book that didn't align with the state's ideology. Specifically, anything Confucian, poetic, or reflective was torched, leaving behind only the legalist texts that said, essentially, obey harder. But fire wasn't enough. He also executed hundreds of scholars, often by burying them alive, because nothing says open to criticism like turning professors into compost. Records say 460 Confucian scholars met that fate. But let's be honest, it was probably more. And if you were caught hiding a banned book, you could join them in the dirt. Qin Shi Huang wanted unity, but what he got was sterile silence. He paved roads, standardized weights, built the Great Wall's early version, and then silenced anyone who might write a poem about it. And yet, his dynasty didn't last. Turns out book burning isn't a long-term governance strategy. But don't worry if China wanted to forget its past. Carthage took the opposite route. They remembered the gods, especially when it came to feeding them children. Ancient Carthage, c. 6th 3rd century BC. Child sacrifice on the altar of Baal. Welcome to Carthage, ancient trade titan, naval powerhouse, and, allegedly, enthusiastic participant in child sacrifice. Yes, while the Carthaginians were calculating shipping routes and inventing complex accounting systems, they were also, according to Greek and Roman sources, tossing their own infants into burning altars to appease the gods Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, because nothing says civic duty like barbecuing your firstborn. Of course, the Romans did have a habit of exaggerating their enemies' sins. But here's the uncomfortable part. Archaeological digs turned up burial grounds known as tophets, filled with urns containing the charred remains of children and animalists accompanied by votive inscriptions. Thousands of them, which means either a massive multi-century accident involving cremation and labeling, or, yeah, they were actually doing it. Some argue these were just tragic deaths. In fact, mortality was high. After Allen, the cremation was ceremonial. Others point out the suspicious volume, the ritual consistency, and the very specific mention of divine offerings. It's hard to ignore that much ash. So next time someone tells you ancient civilizations were peaceful, enlightened societies, just remember, some of them thanked the gods with literal baby fat. And while we're in the mood for self-immolation, let's head to ancient India, where the flames weren't always metaphorical, but the pressure definitely was. Ancient India, c. 5th century AD, the searing silence of Sati. The Gupta Empire is often called a golden age of science, literature, and art in India, which makes it the perfect time to introduce Satith practice, where a widow was expected to burn herself alive on her husband's funeral pyre. Not always mandated by law, of course. Just, strongly encouraged by family, priests, and generations of cultural gaslighting. Nothing says eternal love like being guilt-tripped into spontaneous combustion. To be clear, sati wasn't practiced everywhere or by everyone, but when it happened, it was treated as noble, pious, and somehow romantic. The widow became a sati mata, a pure and exalted figure posthumously, of course. While she was alive, often drugged, restrained, or shamed until the only way out was through fire. Records describe women walking, or being dragged, into the flames amid music and chanting. Families sometimes celebrated it. Others watched in stunned, terrified silence. Because if the widow refused, she could face social exile, or worse, be blamed for her husband's death. This wasn't about love, it was about erasure. And speaking of erasure, our next stop features a king who didn't just kill for love, he demanded a receipt. In the form of 100 Philistine foreskins. Ancient Israel, c. 10th century BC. A bloody bride price for King David. Romance, Biblical edition. A young shepherd named David wants to marry Princess Michal, daughter of King Saul. But Saul, being a supportive father-in-law in the making, sets a wedding price, Not cows, not gold. He wants 100 Philistine foreskins. That's not metaphor. That's not poetic. That's exactly what he asked for, like a grotesque punchline carved into scripture. Now, Saul's motives weren't subtle. He hoped David would die trying. But David, overachiever, slayer of giants, and part-time amateur surgeon, comes back with 200. Double the quota. Just a flex. It's the most disturbing version of winning over the in-laws in recorded history. Let's pause and appreciate the logistics of that. This wasn't war. This was a flesh-for-marriage transaction. One that likely involved battlefield butchery so grotesque it would make even the Assyrians raise an eyebrow. And this isn't a fringe story. It's canon. Sunday school glosses over the details, but the subtext is clear. Divine favor means you get the girl after mutilating 200 men. Love, honor, and body parts. A tale as old as time. Now let's jump to Rome again, where a certain emperor skipped the battlefield and went straight into the incestuous, megalomaniacal, senator-stabbing phase of his career. Early Roman Empire, c. 1st century AD, Caligula and the Theater of Madness. If you ever thought your boss was unstable, take comfort in knowing they're probably not Caligula. Rome's infamous third emperor didn't just break the rules of leadership, he shattered them like a wine goblet against a marble wall while screaming at the moon. His 4-year reign was a fever dream of god-complex theatrics, casual murder, and possible incest with his own sisters as the unwilling stars. Caligula, born Gaius, started out promising enough young, charming, the darling of the empire. Then a fever nearly killed him. When he recovered, Rome quickly realized their emperor was now part divinity, part sadistic game show host. He executed people on whims. He held gladiatorial games where the audience sometimes became the entertainment. He once supposedly said, "I wish the Roman people had but one neck, so he could slice it with one blow." Talk about management by intimidation. And those rumors about incest with his sisters? Ancient historians were vague, yet disturbingly consistent. Whether true or not, they paint a picture of a man who blurred every line political, moral, even biological. Senators were executed for insufficient enthusiasm. Nobles were humiliated. His horse almost got a government position. Rome became a circus, and Caligula was both ringmaster and beast. And speaking of emperors who ruled with brutal flair, meet Justinian, the Byzantine genius who conquered cities with one hand and crushed his own people with the other. Byzantine Empire, c. 6th century AD. Justinian's holy wars and collateral misery. Justinian I, emperor of the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire, wanted glory. He also wanted Italy and North Africa, and maybe a few theological debates to spiral into state-sponsored bloodshed. In short, he wanted the old Roman Empire back, just with better mosaics and worse casualty rates. To make his dream real, he sent his top general, Belisarius, to retake the crumbling western territories. And retake them he did through siege, starvation, and battles that reduced ancient cities to haunted ruins. North Africa was conquered, Italy was bled dry, and the city of Rome changed hands multiple times, each leaving it emptier and more broken than before. The reconquest was technically a success, if your definition of success includes mass civilian deaths and economic collapse. Meanwhile, back home, Justinian crushed the Nika riots' mass protests against his rule by luring the angry mob into the hippodrome and having them all slaughtered. 30,000 people dead in an afternoon. That's not damage control. That's urban renewal by genocide. His building projects were stunning. The Hagia Sophia is still jaw-dropping. But beneath the golden grandeur lay the corpses of a society stretched to its limit. Now let's head south, where, after Muhammad's death, unity was promised. You didn't mind a little apostate slaying to go with your spiritual rebirth. Early Islamic period, c. 632 AD. The Ridda Wars and the price of apostasy. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD, Arabia was a house with shaky walls and a rapidly vanishing roof. Several tribes, having pledged loyalty to the Prophet himself, not to the nascent, decided they were no longer under obligation. They stopped paying taxes. Some reverted to old beliefs. Others declared new prophets of their own. This theological free-for-all was met with a definitive reply: submit or be crushed. Enter the Ridda Wars, the Wars of Apostasy. Under the new Caliph, Abu Bakr, the Muslim state launched a series of violent campaigns to bring the Arabian Peninsula back under control. Apostasy wasn't debated in a council. It was resolved at sword point. Battles raged across the deserts, cities were subdued, and rebel leaders, many of whom claimed divine revelations, were executed. These wars weren't just about belief. They were about power, unity, and the survival of a fragile new order. And in that pursuit, mercy was in short supply. Religious dissent was reframed as political rebellion, and suppression became sanctified. By the end, Arabia was unified. Bloodily, yes, but unified. And while Arabian tribes were being cut down for leaving the faith, the Vikings were across the sea, inventing new ways to pull lungs out of backs for fun, honor, and maybe a good story. Viking Age, c. 9th–11th century AD. The blood eagle and the art of flayed flight. The Vikings had many talents: shipbuilding, storytelling, raiding monasteries with the same glee modern tourists reserve for Parisian bakeries. But their most infamous skill may have been the blood eagle, a supposed execution method, so gruesome it sounds like a fever dream narrated by a berserker on mushrooms. Here's how it allegedly worked. The victim, often a captured enemy or traitor, was restrained, likely kneeling or face down. Their ribs were then hacked open from the back, pulled outward to resemble wings, and their lungs dragged through the gap, alive. The eagle imagery was symbolic. The trauma was not. Whether they actually survived long enough to admire the view is, shall we say, unlikely. Now, scholars debate whether the blood eagle really happened or if it was an Icelandic exaggeration meant to spice up sagas. But the fact that it was believed to be true tells us everything about Viking reputation management. Terror was currency, and this was one hell of a flex. So, if you're ever tempted to romanticize the Norse as rugged freedom lovers, just remember, some of them thought anatomy class made a fine public spectacle. Next up, trial by ordeal, because in medieval Europe, proving innocence often meant surviving an exorcism with props. Medieval Europe, c. 10th century. Trial by ordeal and the divine legal system. Justice in medieval Europe was a peculiar affair. There were no CSI labs, no reliable witnesses, no understanding of basic forensics, just a deep, unshakable belief that God would never let an innocent person suffer. Spoiler, he let plenty suffer. Enter the trial by ordeal. To prove your innocence, you might be forced to plunge your hand into boiling water, carry red-hot iron, or be thrown into a river with your limbs bound. Survive the ordeal? Innocent. Fail and die? Also innocent, but oops. Either way, justice was served, sort of. In one method, accused witches were swum. If you floated, you were in league with Satan and promptly executed. If you sank, congratulations. You weren't a witch, you were just dead. The divine couldn't have been clearer. Sometimes the wounds were examined days later. If they were healing, that meant God approved. If they weren't, well, now you had a nice infection to go with your ruined reputation. This wasn't superstition at the fringes. This was standard. This was law. This was what passed for truth in a society that trusted the supernatural more than the senses. And speaking of trusting the divine, just wait until you hear what starving crusaders decided to snack on. The Crusades, c. 1099. The cannibalism at Ma'ara. Crusaders marched to the Holy Land for glory, salvation, and apparently, dinner. After capturing the city of Ma'ara in 1098, they found themselves trapped. Starvation set in. Supplies ran out, and then things got biblical, but not in the way the Pope intended. When food vanished, the Crusaders began eating the bodies of their Muslim enemies, roasting them, boiling them, stripping flesh from bone. Eyewitness accounts from the Crusaders themselves don't shy away from the horror. One chronicler coolly noted they cooked the adults in pots and impaled children on spits. That's not divine retribution. That's human meat kebab. And what makes it worse? They'd already won the battle. This wasn't about desperation and defeat. It was victory, followed by starvation, followed by mass butchery in the name of faith. The Holy War had officially jumped the shark and devoured it. For all the romanticized chivalry of the Crusades, Ma'ara stands as a grotesque footnote, one that doesn't get sung about by medieval bards. And while these holy warriors were feasting on corpses, back in England, starving peasants were being maimed for the crime of catching dinner in the king's forest. Medieval England, c. 12th century. Forest laws and flesh, ripping justice. Picture this. You're a peasant in medieval England. It's winter. Your children are hungry. The woods are full of deer. Problem solved, right? Wrong. The forest doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the king. And if you're caught hunting for food, you're not just finedy, you're dismembered, or blinded, or castrated, or all three, if someone's feeling especially pious that day. Welcome to the Royal Forest Lawsan, elegant system of ecological dictatorship that turned vast stretches of land into exclusive hunting playgrounds for nobility. What counted as a forest wasn't just woodland either. Whole villages, farmland, and pastures could fall under forest jurisdiction, where even gathering fallen branches could be deemed theft. The penalties weren't just harsh, they were theatrical. Men had their hands cut off for setting traps, eyes gouged out for killing a deer, castration for daring to shoot a boar. This wasn't just punishment, it was deterrence through mutilation, a living billboard of royal wrath. And yet, the forests were still poached, because hunger doesn't read legal notices. But while England punished hunger with brutality, another empire to the east mastered the art of overkill slaughtering entire cities just to make a point. Enter the Mongols. The Mongol Empire, c. 13th century. Genghis Khan and the economics of annihilation. The Mongols didn't conquer cities, they deleted them. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, conquest became a form of cosmic pest control. Find the nest, burn it out, move on. Resistance was met not with negotiation, but with extinction. Full-on population zero extinction. When a city defied Mongol demands, first came the siege engines, then the walls fell, then came the sorting. Artisans and useful professionals were spared. Everyone else? Beheaded, burned, or buried in mass graves. Some cities were so thoroughly annihilated that their locations were forgotten, not abandoned, erased. Why such brutality? Terror was policy. Kill one city and 10 others surrender without a fight. It worked. Genghis Khan built the largest contiguous empire in human history by being the most terrifying rumor on the Silk Road. And they kept records. Mongol scribes noted death tolls like accountants tallying rice. 100,000 dead here, 200,000 there. It was murder as metrics. Even today, some regions remain depopulated from those campaigns, which tells you something about the scale. The Mongols didn't just leave a legacy, they left craters. And speaking of ruthless bureaucracies, let's take a stroll into Spain, where heresy was profitable, especially when it came gift-wrapped with gold teeth and confiscated estates. The Spanish Inquisition, 1478 onwards. holy terror, and the business of heresy. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition except maybe the wealthy, because more than just rooting out heresy, the Inquisition had a profitable little side hustle: asset seizure. If you were accused of religious nonconformity, say, secretly practicing Judaism or Islam, then congratulations! You were eligible for public humiliation, brutal torture, and, if things went well for the church, a redistribution of your estate to them. The process was simple. Someone denounces you. You're arrested. Evidence is optional. You're held in secret, tortured for confession, sentenced in a public spectacle called an auto da fe. If burned, your ashes went to the wind, your possessions to the Inquisition. It wasn't just about faith, it was about control and money. Many nobles and merchants found themselves suddenly heretical at just the right moment, coincidentally, right before their property changed hands. And if you think pleading innocent helped, think again. Confessing gave you a chance to be strangled before burning. Staying silent meant you fried alive. And either way, the church still won. The Inquisition wasn't a detour from Spanish colonial ambitions. It was a dry run, because across the Atlantic, the machinery of control was about to get even bloodier. And the sacrifices? Entire civilizations. PreColombian Americas, c. 15th century. Flower wars and the business of sacrifice. In the Aztec Empire, war wasn't just politics by other means, it was supply chain management for the gods. Welcome to the Flower Wars, a name that sounds poetic until you realize the flowers were screaming human beings, and the harvest was for ritual slaughter. Unlike regular wars, which you might wage to conquer territory or expand borders, flower wars were essentially joint military drills, with rival states' carefully choreographed battles intended to produce live captives. Why live? Because the gods weren't interested in battlefield corpses. No, they wanted the real deal. Beating hearts offered atop temple altars, blood flowing like divine currency to keep the cosmos spinning. The captured weren't just killed, they were paraded, honored, fed, and then publicly sacrificed in ceremonies that were equal parts religious ecstasy and state-sponsored horror show. Everyone had a role: priests, nobles, dancers, drummers. And at the center, some poor captive being opened up like a ceremonial gift. It wasn't genocide, it was theology, logistics, and political theater wrapped in obsidian knives. And while Mesoamerican empires fed gods with hearts, West African kingdoms were feeding Europeans with something far more profitable: human lives sold wholesale, one chained body at a time. West Africa, c. 16th, 17th century. Slave raids and the Dark Partnership. When we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we often picture European ships, iron chains, and colonial plantations. But the horror didn't begin on the coast, it began inland, in the kingdoms of West Africa, where rulers raided their neighbors, captured rivals, and sold them into a system that would erase millions of names from history. This wasn't a one-sided kidnapping spree. Some African leaders participated eagerly, striking deals with Portuguese, Dutch, and English traders. In return for weapons, liquor, or shiny goods, they offered human cargo, often prisoners of war, political enemies, or unlucky villagers plucked from their homes in midnight raids. It was economic pragmatism soaked in blood. Entire regions were depopulated, families torn apart. Children marched in chains through forests to the ports, branded and packed into ships like cattle. Cattle were starved, beaten, and tossed overboard for sneezing. This was not a side effect. This was the system, a dark collaboration between empires and middlemen, profit and dehumanization. And if you thought European involvement ended at the beach, just wait until you meet Renaissance Italy, where politics and poisoning went together like wine and betrayal. Renaissance Italy, c. 15th century. Poison, power, and the Borgia way. Ah, the Italian Renaissance, a time of art, enlightenment, and very creative ways to die. While Michelangelo was carving naked saints out of marble, The elite were busy perfecting the art of murder by mealtime, and no one did it better or more stylishly than the Borgia family. The Borgias were the original, dysfunctional power clan. Pope Alexander VI, his son Cesare, and daughter Lucrezia were whispered to have used poison as casually as others used table salt. Arsenic in the wine, a dusting of deadly herbs in the stew. A quick dose slipped into communion there were endless recipes for ambition. Their targets? Political rivals, inconvenient husbands, overly curious cardinals. The motive? Power consolidation and a real estate portfolio that stretched from Rome to Naples. Accusations of incest, bribery, and murder swirled around them like incense in a burning chapel. Were they all true? Maybe not. But in Italy at the time, credibility didn't matter as much as fear. And the most terrifying part? They weren't even unique. Poison was the LinkedIn of Renaissance politics, a way to network, eliminate competition, and climb the ladder with no fingerprints. But speaking of handshakes turned executions, let's sail west to Peru, where the Incas welcomed the Spanish with gold and got slaughtered for their hospitality. Conquest of the Inca Empire, 1532. The Golden Trap of Atahualpa. It started with a handshake and ended in a bloodbath. When Francisco Pizarro and his band of conquistadors arrived in the Incan Empire, they brought gifts, guns, diseases, and a very flexible moral code. Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, made the fatal mistake of meeting them in peace. Thousands of his followers came with him, unarmed, festively dressed. It was a diplomatic reception. Pizarro interpreted it as a sale. In what can only be described as a treacherous ambush disguised as brunch, the Spanish opened fire, unleashed cannons, and slaughtered everyone they could reach. Thousands died in a matter of hours. Atahualpa was taken prisoner, his people butchered, and the Spanish? They barely got scratched. The Inca, with their sophisticated empire, didn't see it coming. To buy his freedom, Atahualpa promised to fill a room with gold, literally, floor to ceiling, and he did. The Spanish took it, melted it down, and executed him anyway. Because when you're driven by God and gold, mercy's just a logistical burden. The fall of the Inca wasn't just a conquest, it was a con job. A handshake turned hostage crisis, turned genocide. And back in Europe? That same year, a wedding turned into a holy bloodbath that would soak France in Protestant corpses. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, 1572, when matrimony met mass murder. The French thought a royal wedding would solve their religious problems. Instead, it triggered a nationwide slaughter. In August 1572, Paris prepared to celebrate the marriage of Catholic Princess Margaret of Valois and the Protestant Henry of Navarre, a union meant to patch up decades of tension between Catholics and Huguenots. It was unity through romance. What could go wrong? Answer: everything. Days into the festivities, with Huguenot leaders conveniently gathered in one place, Catholic forces, allegedly with Queen Catherine de' Medici's blessing, launched a precision bloodbath. Protestant nobles were butchered in their beds. The Seine ran red. Churches became execution chambers. Over the next few days, mobs took over. The violence spread to the countryside. Tens of thousands died in a national purge disguised as divine justice. What began as a wedding gift turned into an open grave. The message was clear. Tolerance had limits, and those limits ended at the altar. And while France was slaughtering Huguenots, Spanish America was refining its own system of slow-motion death, one forced labor shift at a time. The Spanish colonial system, 16th century, repartimiento and the mechanics of misery. Colonial Spain had a talent for bureaucracies, especially when it came to exploitation. Enter the repartimiento system, a tidy, legalistic way to extract labor from indigenous populations without technically calling it slavery. It was temporary, regulated, and, for the crown, it was also a death sentence wrapped in paperwork. Unlike the earlier encomienda system, which gave whole villages to conquistadors like living trophies, the repartimiento parceled out labor in shifts. Natives were forced to work in mines, on farms, in textile sweatshops, often hundreds of miles from home. In theory, it was rotational and humane. In reality, it was grinding, brutal, and virtually inescapable. Workers were starved, beaten, and exposed to European diseases for which they had no immunity. Entire regions saw their populations collapse. Some fled, others died. Most just disappeared into the numbers labor units measured in quotas, not names. The Spanish justified it with Christian doctrine and legal loopholes, turning theology into a spreadsheet of suffering. And like all good systems of oppression, it kept the gold flowing. Meanwhile, half a world away, another colonial corporation was perfecting its own brand of capitalism with nutmeg, swords, and total annihilation. The Dutch East India Company, 17th century. Monopoly by massacre. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, was technically a business. A shareholder-run megacorp with a logo, a navy, and the charming habit of decimating entire populations when negotiations got inconvenient. The VOC wasn't just about spice-set, was about domination. And when it came to nutmeg, they played for keeps. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Banda Islands, home of the precious nutmeg tree. The native Bandanese people had their own trading systems and weren't particularly eager to become Dutch serfs. So the VOC did what any rational enterprise would do. It launched a corporate-sponsored massacre. In 1621, under the leadership of Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a man whose job title should have included enthusiastic exterminator, the Dutch invaded, tortured local leaders, and killed or enslaved nearly the entire population. Survivors were hunted down or relocated. The islands were then repopulated with slaves and governed like spice factories with guard towers. This wasn't war. It was market regulation with blood. And it worked. The Dutch secured their monopoly, Europe got its nutmeg, and an entire culture was erased in the footnotes of quarterly profits. But the Dutch weren't alone in deploying secret terror. Ming Dynasty China had its own way of silencing dissent with embroidered uniforms and the quiet knock of death. Ming Dynasty China, c. 15th century. The Jinyue and the Emperor's Hidden Blade. In the glittering palaces of Ming China, beneath the jade, gold, and Confucian virtue, something slithered through the corridors, the Jinyue, the Emperor's secret police. Their name meant Embroidered Uniform Guard, which sounds adorable until you realize they were embroidered with fear. Founded during the reign of the Hongwu Emperor, the Jinyue weren't just bodyguards. They were spies, interrogators, and sometimes executioners. They answered only to the emperor, no courts. No oversight, just loyalty and the permission to disappear people like a magician's trick gone wrong. They roamed the empire with absolute authority. If they suspected treason, corruption, or simply an inconvenient opinion, they could arrest you, torture you, and kill you all without trial. Interrogations took place in secret prisons, often ending with forced confessions inked in blood. Even high-ranking officials weren't safe. The Jinyue were infamous for monitoring court politics and eliminating rivals to the throne, often before breakfast. Their presence kept everyone in line, not with law, but with dread. And as dynasties fell and rose, the method remained terror in silk. And speaking of terror, the 30 Years' War in Europe wasn't about spies or whispers. It was about open, messy, sustained brutality mercenaries, religion, and civilians caught in the blast radius. The 30 Years' War, 1618, 1648. When God took a side and everyone died. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when an entire continent has a theological tantrum with muskets, look no further than the 30 Years' War. It began as a Catholic-Protestant squabble in the Holy Roman Empire, and spiraled into 3 decades of scorched earth, famine, mass rape, and pillaging so widespread that some towns lost over half their populations. This wasn't just war, it was apocalypse by contract. Mercenaries were the main actors, roving bands of professional soldiers with no loyalty except to coin. And when they didn't get paid, which was often, they paid themselves. Villages were stripped bare. Peasants raped, burned, or conscripted. Entire regions depopulated. This wasn't military strategy. It was legalized looting. Religious motives gave it cover. Political alliances gave it fuel. And the people on the ground? Collateral damage in a divine divorce settlement. Even when peace treaties were signed, it was hard to tell, so much had been flattened already. By the end, the war had redrawn Europe's map, crushed its spirit, and introduced the concept of total war long before the modern world gave it a name. And yet, amid this chaos, empires elsewhere were carrying out their own purges, not for land, but for the soul. Just ask the Mughals. The Mughal Empire, c. 16th-17th century. Aurangzeb and the theology of destruction. Aurangzeb, 6th emperor of the Mughal Empire, was devout, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient in turning India's religious pluralism into an imperial monologue. While his predecessors balanced conquest with relative tolerance, Aurangzeb decided God didn't need diversity, just uniformity, enforced at sword point. Under his rule, Hindu temples were raised like weeds in a garden of orthodoxy. It wasn't just about religion, it was a calculated way to erase regional power bases and replace them with centralized loyalty. The tax on non-Muslims, known as jizya, was reinstated. Religious officials were empowered. Cultural and architectural expression was reined in, unless it bowed to the proper theology. The destruction wasn't random, it was policy. Temples like the Kashi Vishwanath were torn down, often replaced with mosques. And for those who objected, rebels were hunted, religious leaders imprisoned, whole communities punished. Aurangzeb didn't just want to rule India, he wanted to purify it. The result? Centuries of resentment and rebellion, a cracked empire by the time of his death, and the slow erosion of Mughal grandeur. And if religious purging sounds harsh, just wait until we cross into Persia, where even being royal didn't save you from a father's paranoia and a blade's edge. Safavid Persia, c. 16th century. Shah Abbas and the blinding of legacy. Shah Abbas. I was a master of architecture, empire building, and blinding his own sons. Because nothing says dynastic confidence quite like mutilating your heirs so they can't overthrow your or anyone else, really. In Safavid Persia, paranoia was not a vice. It was a statecraft survival strategy. Abbas reigned with a vision, literally, a vision that required removing anyone who might develop one of their own. So when his sons showed potential, he didn't groom them for power. He eliminated the threat. One was executed, the others, blinded. A tradition that effectively removed them from the line of succession without spilling too much royal blood, just enough for the message. This wasn't uncommon in the Islamic monarchies of the time. Physical perfection was often a prerequisite for kingship. No eyes, no throne. Abbas wanted absolute control, even if it meant burning his own family tree from the top down. And the irony? The empire thrived under Heimarts flourished, trade routes thrived, and Isfahan became a crown jewel. All while his potential successors wandered the palace, sightless and forgotten. And speaking of forgotten, let's head to feudal Japan, where rebellion sparked not enlightenment but blood, fire, and the steel-tipped boot of the samurai. Medieval Japan, Sengoku period, 15th, 16th century. Ikki uprisings and the iron fist of order. Feudal Japan during the Sengoku period was basically a multi-century bar fight with banners. Warlords battled each other. Castles rose and fell. And amid all this noble chaos, the peasants, those eternally trampled, rice-farming nobody shad, the audacity to fight back. Enter the Iki, mass peasant uprisings driven by desperation, rage, and the knowledge that the system would never give them peace unless they clawed it out of the mud. The Iki weren't just angry mobs. They were semi-organized leagues farmers, monks, even some disaffected samurai joining forces to push back against crushing taxes, military conscription, and samurai abuse. They seized towns, stormed castles, established temporary local governments, and for a moment, they tasted power. Then came the counter-reaction. Samurai lords, having regained their balance, retaliated with disproportionate violence. Entire villages were burned, rebels executed en masse, leaders crucified or decapitated, and their heads paraded like grotesque trophies. This was suppression as message, rebellion turned into a cautionary tale. The Iki never truly disappeared, but their legacy became one of caution more than revolution. And while Japan bled its poor for order, France was still busy devouring its own, even as starving Protestants resorted to eating the dead just to outlast a siege. The French Wars of Religion, 16th century. La Rochelle and the Communion of Corpses. During the siege of La Rochelle in 1627, Catholic France tightened its grip around the last major Huguenot stronghold, a walled city determined to survive by sheer will and eventually, by the flavor of the recently deceased. The war between Protestants and Catholics had long since stopped being about theology and more about attrition, stubbornness, and the art of starving your enemy into submission. Inside La Rochelle, food ran out. Horses, dogs, rats eaten, wallpaper glue, scraped off and boiled for protein. But when even those delicacies were gone, the citizens of this Protestant holdout did what desperation always demands. They turned to the dead. Not the enemy dead, their own. Families buried their loved ones in shallow graves, then later dug them back up. It wasn't done lightly, but it was done. And as French royal forces camped just beyond the walls, watching smoke and silence, they likely knew exactly what was happening. That was the point. Siege warfare wasn't just about cutting off food, it was about cutting off dignity. In the end, the city surrendered, not to force, but to hunger. And while French Protestants were dining on their deceased, the high seas were calling to pirates with letters of marque and a legal excuse for murder. The use of privateers and buccaneers, 16th, 17th century. Piracy. With paperwork. Picture a pirate. Now give him a lawyer. Congratulations, you've just invented the privateer. During the golden age of imperial plundering, European powers realized they could outsource naval aggression by giving freelance thugs a permission slip. These were letters of marque, legal documents that turned looters into authorized agents of maritime warfare. The only real difference between a privateer and a pirate? The flag. England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands all got in on the action. Rival nations' ships were fair game. Coastal settlements? Bonus points. Torture, murder, looting, it was all good, as long as it targeted the right enemy. The most successful privateers became national heroes back home. Their mass violence translated into treasure chests and patriotic ballads. And if a few neutral ships got accidentally sacked along the way, oops. The system was beautifully hypocritical. Nations got plausible deniability. Pirates got promotions, victims got silence. And sometimes, when peace was declared, these once honored sea wolves were abandoned or hunted, which only pushed them into full piracy. But no maritime mercenary could match the brutality of Cromwell in Ireland, where entire towns paid the price for resisting a holy revolution in armor. The English Civil War, 1642 1651. Cromwell and the Irish Blood Debt. Oliver Cromwell, hero of Parliament, scourge of kings, and if you're Irish plague, in human form. After the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I, Cromwell turned his righteous fury across the Irish Sea. His mission? To crush Catholic resistance. His method? Total war, Protestant vengeance, and a ledger soaked in red. The sieges of Drogheda and Wexford are infamous for their merciless efficiency. At Drogheda, Cromwell's troops breached the walls and butchered not only Irish Catholic soldiers but civilians, priests, even prisoners who had already surrendered. In Wexford, the pattern repeated only messier. Civilians fled into the sea and were cut down in the waves. Churches were turned into slaughterhouses. Cromwell defended it all with chilling logic. These were God's enemies. Divine justice, he claimed, had been served. To him, this wasn't massacre, it was purification. But for the Irish, it was generational trauma. Whole populations displaced, land seized, a blueprint for future colonization. And while England weaponized Protestant rage, another empire was institutionalizing something even darker, fratricide as royal policy, where bloodlines became nooses and brothers were born to be buried. The Ottoman Empire. C. 15th, 17th century. Fratricide as a succession plan. In most families, sibling rivalry means passive-aggressive birthday cards or awkward Thanksgivings. In the Ottoman Empire, it meant waking up with a silk cord around your neck, and that was the polite version. When a new sultan took the throne, tradition dictated that he eliminate all his brothers, not metaphorically, not politically, literally, as in executed by royal decree, to preserve stability. This system of state-sponsored fratricide was institutionalized under Mehmed II, who decided that the best way to avoid civil war was to make sure no one else lived long enough to challenge the crown. Newly crowned sultans would order the execution of any male siblings, infants included. Some were strangled immediately. Others were kept in luxurious prison palaces called the cafes, where they lived like golden ghosts until they were needed or disposed of. It worked. The empire avoided constant succession crises, but at what cost? The court was soaked in paranoia. Mothers pleaded for their sons' lives. Eunuchs became power brokers. And the throne became a blood-soaked chair of lonely victories. But if fratricide feels efficient in a psychopathic kind of way, let's detour to a different fire, one that literally gutted a city and set its xenophobia ablaze. The Great Fire of London, 1666. Arson, accusation, and convenient foreigners. London burned for 4 days in 1666, and by the end of it, the city's medieval heart was ash and dust. But while the fire devoured houses, churches, and entire neighborhoods, it also ignited something older, darker, and far more resilient than timber: scapegoating. The fire likely began in a bakery on Pudding Lane, because of course it did, but no one wanted a humble oven mishap to explain such biblical devastation. The public needed a villain. Enter foreigners. Dutch, French, Catholics, didn't matter. If your accent was off or your religion was wrong, you became the arsonist of the hour. Lynch mobs roamed the ruins. Innocent people were beaten, imprisoned, killed. Rumors flew like embers, secret Catholic plots, foreign conspiracies, firebombs hidden in bread. Even a poor Frenchman with hearing loss was accused of not reacting fast enough, so he was torn apart by a mob. The government, of course, leaned into the chaos. It was easier than admitting negligence. Rebuilding the city was one thing. Rebuilding public sanity would take a bit longer. And while London blamed foreigners for a fire, countless other societies were busy blaming babies, because sometimes history's cruelties begin in the cradle. The use of infanticide in many societies. Population control by cribside ethics. In ancient and medieval societies across the world, unwanted infants were dealt with in a manner that combined cold economics, superstition, and twisted practicality. They were left to die. Sometimes it was exposure, sometimes it was drowning, Sometimes it was just the quiet absence of food. Infanticide wasn't always an act of malicide, was often presented as necessity. In societies where food was scarce and every child meant another mouth to feed, girls were disproportionately discarded, especially in patriarchal cultures where lineage mattered more than life. Disabled children, often seen as omens, curses, or burdens. Goodbye. From Sparta to China, from Celtic tribes to island communities, the logic held, better to sacrifice the helpless than starve the whole. Religion occasionally sanctioned it, philosophers justified it, midwives were complicit. And it wasn't hidden. It was normalized, a feature, not a bug. Sometimes, gods were involved. Sometimes, it was just the way things are. And while these children died nameless in fields and forests, society marched on refined, orderly, and morally anesthetized. Now, let's turn to those who weren't killed, but simply cast out, branded, unclean, and exiled to the margins, carrying their disease and shame like a walking death sentence. Medieval Europe, the persecution of lepers. In a world without germ theory, medieval Europe turned to its favorite diagnostic tool, panic. Enter the leper, poster child for divine punishment and society's rotting conscience. Leprosino, known as Hansen's disease, wasn't just an illness. It was a moral verdict. If you had it, God clearly had a problem with you, and so did everyone else. Lepers were exiled from towns, stripped of property, and sometimes declared legally dead. Fun, right? They were made to wear distinctive clothing, often with bells or clapper, so that the clean could hear them coming and scatter like pigeons at the sound of divine wrath on two legs. In some places, lepers were forced to announce themselves out loud, just in case the sound of their decay didn't speak for itself. Lazar houses and leper colonies became their ghettos, cloistered sanctuaries of slow decay and social death. Priests would even perform a mock funeral service upon a leper's exilias if being eaten alive by bacteria wasn't enough. You also had to mourn yourself before dying. And society didn't just pity Thamit, feared them, moralized them, weaponized their suffering. But if lepers were cast out to die slowly, Christians under Diocletian's rule didn't even get the luxury of slow. They got torches, racks, and public theaters of holy agony. The Great Persecution, 303–311 AD, Rome's final war on Christianity. In the twilight years of pagan Rome, Emperor Diocletian decided he'd had enough of the Christian nuisance. They weren't sacrificing to the right gods. They refused to worship the emperor. They were ruining the vibes. Solution? Launch the last and most ferocious persecution of Christians the empire would ever see. Edicts were issued across the empire. Destroy churches, burn scriptures, imprison clergy. Soon after came the real fun-forced sacrifices to Roman gods under pain of torture, mutilation, or death. And this wasn't just lions in the arena entertainment, though there was plenty of that. It was also the grim, administrative business of dragging believers out of their homes, into dungeons, onto racks. Christians were flogged, flayed, burned alive, and beheaded. Some had molten metal poured over them, others were crucified upside down. The whole thing was meant to break the faith with fear. Spoiler, it didn't work. Instead of disappearing, Christianity became stronger martyrdom transformed into a recruitment poster. Diocletian eventually retired to a cabbage farm, true story. And his persecution became a failure so total it's now taught in Sunday school. But Rome wasn't done inventing apocalypses. Up next, the Albigensian Crusade, where heretics were hunted with such enthusiasm, no one even bothered to check who was who. The Albigensian Crusade, 1209, 1229, kill them all, God will know his own. If the medieval church had a suggestion box, it would read, please report all heretics, preferably in bulk. And in 1209, it got its biggest haul yet, the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France whose theology was just weird enough to justify a holy war. The Cathars believed the material world was evil, which made them unpopular with the Vatican, an institution known for its enthusiasm for gold, land, and ornamental everything. So Pope Innocent III launched a crusade not against Muslims this time, but fellow Christians. At Béziers, when papal forces asked how to tell Cathars from Catholics, the abbot reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." And they did. Men, women, children, no need for questions. The entire town was put to the sword. Some were burned alive in churches they had sought for refuge. The massacre set the tone for 2 decades of extermination, siege warfare, and theological arson. This wasn't about conversion, it was about erasure. The Cathar faith was eventually wiped out, but the methods, they stuck around. And speaking of tactical horror, the Mongols were about to weaponize disease in a siege so grotesquely brilliant it may have doomed half of Europe. The Golden Horde, 13th century. Plague corpses and the siege of Kaffa. The Mongols weren't exactly known for subtlety, but in 1346, during the siege of the Genoese-controlled city of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, they decided to add a little flair to their usual brutal efficiency. How? By inventing one of the earliest recorded forms of biological warfare. And no, it wasn't subtle. As the story goes, the Mongols ravaged by plague catapulted the bodies of their own infected soldiers over Kaffa's fortified walls, not as a message, not as a funeral, but as disease delivery systems. It wasn't just grotesque. It was genius-level warfare with a side of biohazard. The terrified defenders, surrounded by the stench of rotting, bubonic-infected corpses, eventually fled right onto Genoese ships headed back to Europe. They brought the plague with them. The Black Death, as it would come to be known, soon exploded across the continent, killing somewhere between 1/3 and half of Europe's population. So if you've ever wondered how a Mongol siege helped wipe out millions who never even saw a horseman, it all began with a trebuchet and some well-placed corpses. And as the plague moved west, society's fabric began to rot with it. Mass graves, walled villages, priests fleeing flocks. Which brings us to the next chapter. Europe's messiest brush with divine pest control. The Black Death, 1346, 1353, mass graves and the collapse of everything. You know it's bad when the cemeteries have wait lists. The Black Death swept across Europe like a biblical punishment, killing so fast and so indiscriminately that entire villages vanished in days. Buboes swelled. Blood oozed. People died in the streets, in their beds, in their prayers, and the worst part? No one had a clue why. Medicine? Useless. Doctors wore bird beak masks filled with herbs like aromatherapy could cure hemorrhaging. Clergy either died en masse or ran for the hills. Families abandoned each other. Neighbors nailed doors shut on the sick. Fear spread faster than the disease. In a panic, some towns turned to arson. Whole villages were burned to the ground, not by invading armies, but by desperate authorities trying to contain the bad air. Mass graves opened like mouths. Bodies were stacked like firewood, then covered, forgotten. Death became so common it stopped being tragic and started being normal. And what followed the plague wasn't peace, it was paranoia. The healthy blamed the sick, the rich blamed the poor, and everyone blamed the Jews. Because when a civilization gets sick enough, it starts purging. Which brings us straight back to the Americas, where colonizers found a legal way to enslave entire populations under the guise of salvation. The Spanish colonization of the Americas, 16th century. Encomienda and the theology of slavery. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, they didn't just bring horses, steel, and smallpox. They brought legalese specifically, the encomienda system, a masterclass in colonial doublespeak. The crown told conquistadors they couldn't technically own the natives, That would be slavery, and Spain was Christian now. Instead, they could entrust the natives to themselves, teach them Spanish, convert them, civilize them. In return, the natives would owe, what's the word, labor for free, in perpetuity. The encomendero was lord, priest, and executioner rolled into one. Indigenous people worked mines, built settlements, and harvested crops under conditions that made Roman slavery look like a trust fund internship. Overwork, disease, and despair hollowed out entire civilizations. Populations dropped by 90% in some regions, not just from germs, but from systemic, grinding, soul-annihilating abuse. And the church? It preached salvation while turning a blind eye to the labor camps next door. Occasionally, a priest would object. Bartolomé de las Casas tried. He wrote letters. He wept. But the gold kept flowing, and the dead kept piling up. Because, in this system, salvation came after death, and death came quickly. Meanwhile, back in colonial Virginia, the English were discovering what desperation truly meant when hunger made neighbors look like food. Early colonial Virginia, 17th century. The starving time and the taste of desperation. In 1609, the English colony of Jamestown was supposed to be the shining example of Protestant ambition in the New World. What it became instead was a horrific petri dish of starvation, madness, and yes, cannibalism. The winter of 1610, now grimly remembered as the starving time, stripped Jamestown of its pretense and its people, leaving behind a frozen tableau of desperation. Food supplies had dwindled after drought, mismanagement, and hostile relations with the local Powhatan. Relief ships were delayed, crops failed. Colonists ate leather shoes, rats, roots, and eventually, each other. One man reportedly murdered his wife, salted her flesh, and was executed after being caught mid-meal. Archaeological digs centuries later confirmed the rumor's bones butchered with kitchen knives, skulls cracked open for marrow. Of the roughly 500 settlers, only about 60 survived the winter. And when the English finally returned with ships and supplies, they found a colony clinging to life like a corpse propped in a chair. The New World dream had teeth marks in it. And while English settlers were devouring their dead, back in Europe, women were being dunked in rivers to see if they floated because nothing says justice like forced aquatic metaphysics. The witch hunts in Europe, 15th, 17th century. Swimming the witch and the sinking truth. In the grand European tradition of solving spiritual crises with torture, few rituals were more absurder, more deadly than swimming the witch. Picture this. A woman is accused of witchcraft. There's no evidence, but plenty of suspicion, so she's bound hand and foot and thrown into a body of water. If she sinks, innocent but dead. If she floats, guilty and soon to be burned. It's a lose-lose hydrological nightmare. This wasn't some fringe practice. It was widespread and deadly serious. Communities gathered around like it was theater. A nice day out. Bring the kids. Watch your neighbor drown or get dragged out screaming for a trial she wouldn't survive anyway. The logic, if you can call it that, came from twisted theology. Water, being pure, would reject the witch. The real miracle was how many people believed it, how eagerly they suspended reality for the comforting certainty of scapegoats. Behind every witch dunking was a tangle of motives: property disputes, misogyny, superstition, boredom, and when water didn't do the job, there were always fire, racks, or ropes. And long before Protestant reformers challenged Catholic dogma, others had tried to crack open the Bible only to find the flames of truth quite literal. The suppression of the Lollards, 15th century, burning the Word and its readers. Long before Martin Luther nailed his thesis to a door, the Lollards were already poking the bear. These English proto-Protestants, inspired by theologian John Wycliffe, had a radical idea: maybe people should read the Bible for themselves, in English, out loud, without a priest interpreting every syllable through layers of Latin, tradition, and state control. The Church, naturally, reacted with the grace of a match to dry straw. Possessing a Bible in English could be a death sentence. Translating it? Worse. Lollards were hunted, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. Their books were destroyed, their bodies reduced to ash, and their beliefs condemned as sedition wrapped in scripture. This wasn't just about theology. It was about control over truth, language, and salvation. Letting commoners read sacred texts meant empowering them to question authority. And in a world where literacy was power, that was unforgivable. The flames that consumed the Lollards would be fanned again in the Reformation, but for now, their words smoldered underground, waiting. And as the Church fought to silence heresy with fire, society found new ways to humiliate sinners publicly through hardware designed for maximum shame. The use of public shaming devices, stocks, pillories, and the scold's bridle. Before reality television, before Twitter takedowns, there was medieval Europe's favorite pastime, public shaming. And they didn't just yell at you in the street, they strapped you into custom-designed humiliation furniture. The stocks, the pillory, and the ever-charming scold's bridle weren't just punishments. They were performance art, interactive, community-driven, and wildly dehumanizing. The stocks immobilized your feet. The pillory clamped your head and hands. Both put you at perfect projectile height for rotten vegetables, insults, and the occasional stone. People came out for it like it was a festival. You got to contemplate your moral failures while the local drunkard spat on your shoes. Then there was the scold's bridly metal cage fitted over the head, with a spiked plate to suppress the tongue. This one was mostly for mouthy women, accused of gossiping, nagging, or, existing too loudly. Wearing it turned you into a walking sermon on obedience. These punishments weren't about justice, they were about conformity, spectacle, and social control. And they worked, at least until the next poor soul needed correcting. But not all chains were visible. Some came in the form of iron collars, ankle shackles, and a ship's cargo hold welcome to the Middle Passage. The transatlantic slave trade, 16th, 17th century. The Middle Passage and the anatomy of horror. Forget everything you think you know about hell. The Middle Passage was worse. It wasn't just a journey, it was a calculated compression of human suffering into floating coffins disguised as commerce. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, millions of Africans were captured, sold, and crammed into slave ships bound for the Americas. The conditions were so grotesque, they defy statistics. Bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, chained together in darkness, lying in their own filth for weeks. Disease was rampant, air was scarce. Food was minimal, screams, sobs, silence, then death. And when someone died, their body was sometimes left for days before being tossed overboard if it wasn't eaten by rats first. An estimated 15–20% died before even reaching land. That's not a margin of error. That's a design feature. The trade was so profitable, merchants factored in a death rate the way you might calculate shipping costs. The survivors were auctioned, like cattle, branded, renamed, erased. This wasn't just forced labor, it was identity murder on a civilizational scale. And while slaves were shackled across the Atlantic, England was drafting laws to neatly sort the poor into categories, cages, and cheap labor markets. The English Poor Laws, 1601, categorizing misery into policy. Poverty isn't a crime unless you lived in 17th century England. The Poor Law of 1601 turned destitution into a bureaucratic puzzle with one clear solution: make being poor as punishing as possible. It divided the needy into categories: the deserving poor, too old, too sick; the undeserving poor, able-bodied but jobless; and the kids useful only if they could be trained into obedient little workers. For the undeserving, help came with conditions. You could earn your bread, but only through forced labor in grim institutions called workhouses. These weren't charities. They were factories of human erosion where rules were strict, sleep was scarce, and the food made rats look appetizing. Families were often separated, children put to work. It wasn't rehabilitation, it was deterrence. The ideology was simple. Poverty was a moral failing. And to fix it, you had to suffer just enough to scare others into working harder, dying faster. Charity became surveillance. Aid became punishment. And while England drafted these blueprints for institutional cruelty, up north in Scotland, they were busy lighting bonfires under women accused of consorting with demons because if your crops failed, clearly someone was hexing your turnips. The burning times in Scotland, 16th-17th century, witch hunts, and the bonfire economy. Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries was a place of mist, moss, and mass executions. While much of Europe had moved on to more politically convenient atrocities, Scotland doubled down on witches. They didn't just dabble in a few trials, they industrialized the burnings. Per capita, Scotland executed more people for witchcraft than nearly any other country in Europe. Why? Because fear, religion, and cold weather make one hell of a brew. The logic was circular. Crops failed? Witches. Child died? Witches. Milk curdled on a Wednesday? Definitely witches. The accused were usually women widows, healers, the eccentric, the poor. Accusations were often made by neighbors, then confirmed under torture, sometimes with thumbscrews or sleep deprivation until the person confessed to flying with the devil or making cows infertile with a glare. Then came the fire, not symbolic, real, public, celebratory in its own sick way. Communities gathered to watch. Prayers were said. Bodies were reduced to ash, then quietly forgotten. And yet, the system fed itself fear-bred denunciation, denunciation bred trials, trials fed the flames. But Scotland wasn't the only culture setting humans on fire. Some Celtic tribes preferred their sacrifices seasonal, oversized, and made of wicker. The use of human sacrifice in some Celtic cultures, the wicker man and the pyre of the tribe. Long before Hollywood turned it into folk horror camp, the wicker man was a symbol of ritual sacrifice among certain Celtic tribes. According to ancient sources, particularly Roman ones, who were always happy to paint their enemies as monsters, the Celts constructed towering effigies of woven wood, filled them with live captives, and set them ablaze. A crowd pleaser, if you're into mass immolation. These weren't criminals being executed. They were sacrifisto, gods of war, harvest, or simply the unknowable rhythms of the universe. Sometimes animals, sometimes humans, sometimes both, layered like a ritual lasagna. The victims burned alive inside a creaking, crackling sculpture, their screams considered an acceptable part of the rite. It's debated whether this practice was widespread or exaggerated Roman propaganda, but the fact that it was plausible says plenty. It reflected a world where fire purified, appeased, and punctuated the calendar with terror. Modern reconstructions tend to skip the human sacrifice part, probably for the best. But if pagan tribes lit up prisoners for divine favor, Christian societies took a more legalistic approaches, especially when it came to love that dared not speak its name. The persecution of sodomy, 16th-17th century. Burning desire, burning bodies. In early modern Europe, sodomy was less a legal category than a catch-all bucket for anything outside the church-approved missionary handbook. Homosexuality, especially between men, was framed not just as sin, but as an existential threat to society. And the punishment? Flame. Burning at the stake wasn't reserved for witches and heretics. It was also a preferred method for dealing with unnatural vice. In England, France, Spain, and beyond, men cautor rumortae be engaging in homosexual acts were publicly tried, shamed, and then executed in the most humiliating and painful way possible. These weren't just moral judgments. They were public spectacles designed to assert control over bodies and desires. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was obliteration. Names erased, bodies destroyed, memories unspoken. And it wasn't limited to monarchies or theocratic enclaves. Even Renaissance Italy, so famous for its celebration of male beauty, carried out sodomy trials with ruthless zeal. Love was not just forbidden, it was criminal, punishable by fire, rope, or exile. And as desire was policed and punished, the Crown of England created a chamber of whispers and torture, designed to silence political dissent with secrecy and steel. The Star Chamber, in England, 15th, 17th century, justice without a jury. If you ever wondered what would happen if Kafka designed a courtroom and handed the keys to a monarch, look no further than the Star Chamber. Operating under the reign of England's Tudor and Stuart dynasties, this ominously named institution was supposed to handle crimes too sensitive or too political for regular courts. In practice, it became a velvet-gloved iron fist. No jury, no transparency, often no formal charges until the sentence was already warming on the fire. The accused were summoned, interrogated sometimes, tortured and sentenced behind closed doors. Everything about it was theatrical, except the part where your freedom evaporated. Often the crime was seditious libel, which meant saying anything unflattering about those in power. Satirical pamphlet? Jail. Disagreeable sermon? Iron mask. Displeased the wrong duke? Good luck ever seeing your family again. The chamber got its name from the decorative stars on the ceiling. Cute touch for a place that specialized in extinguishing reputations, careers, and occasionally lives. The Star Chamber was eventually abolished in 1641. Its abuses too egregious even for its era. But its legacy lived on in every whispered threat and closed-door hearing that followed. Meanwhile, in the Andes, Spain had built a different kind of courtroom where the sentence was labor and the appeal was death. The Mita system in Peru, 16th-17th century, forced labor by royal decree. When Spain conquered the Inca Empire, they didn't just inherit gold, they inherited an empire-wide infrastructure built on compulsory labor. The Spanish, ever industrious, tweaked it slightly and renamed it Mita. But what had once been an Inca tax in labor became, under colonial rule, a conveyor belt of death. Under Mita, indigenous men were conscripted into mining and industrial work, particularly in the silver-rich mountain hellscape of Potosi. Every year, thousands were marched to the mines, forced to work brutal shifts in oxygen-starved shafts, with primitive tools and zero protections. Mercury exposure, tunnel collapses, and exhaustion weren't hazards, they were expectations. Families were broken, populations collapsed, whole villages became ghost towns as men never returned. The work was unpaid, the conditions lethal, and resistance was met with brutal reprisal. The Spanish crown framed it as a civic duty, almost benevolent, even while siphoning wealth to fund European wars and royal vanity projects. The death toll? Impossible to measure accurately, but the echoes still haunt the altitudes. And while the Andes bled for silver, back in Ireland, survivors of a shipwreck faced a different fate, not labor, not exile, but the cold steel of the English blade. The Spanish Armada, 1,588, shipwrecks and shoreline massacres. The Spanish Armada's failed attempt to invade England in 1588 is usually told as a naval blundera, glorious, Protestant, wind-blessed victory. What gets less attention is what happened after the storm wrecked dozens of Spanish ships along the Irish coast. Those who survived the sea weren't so lucky on land. Shipwrecked sailors crawled ashore, soaked, wounded, starving. Many hoped for mercy. What they got instead was execution, systematic and efficient. English forces, under orders and without hesitation, hunted down survivors, and slaughtered them. Not just soldiers, everyone. In some cases, entire groups of castaways were dragged to cliffs or fields and hacked to pieces. Why? Officially, to prevent regrouping. Unofficially, to send a message: no quarter, no sanctuary, no survival. Irish locals who offered help were punished as traitors. Some tried anyway. Others turned over the sailors to curry favor out of sheer fear. So much for Christian charity. And while these stranded men died with salt still on their skin, England's own queen was preparing to light fires closer to home-burning Protestants alive under the blood-stained banner of Catholic redemption. The reign of Bloody Mary Tudor, 1553, 1558. Faith, fire, and the heretics' pyre. Mary I of England had a simple goal: make England Catholic again. She also had a simple method: set Protestants on fire until the kingdom got the message. In her 5-year reign, nearly 300 religious dissenters were burned at the stakemen: women, the elderly, even teenage girls, all publicly, all legally, all in God's name. Mary inherited a country lurching between faiths. Her father, Henry VIII, had yanked England out of Rome's orbit for the sake of divorce. Her brother, Edward VI, leaned Protestant. Mary, devout to the bone, tried to reverse it all with kindling and conviction. Trials were quick, confessions coerced, mercy scarce. Victims were paraded, tied to posts, and lit up in town squares while the crowd watched their flesh melt like wax. It was supposed to be cleansing. It was horror, made into theology. The executions became infamous not just for their number, but for their deliberate slowness. Burning wasn't just a death sentence. It was a public sermon written in smoke and screams. Mary died childless, her legacy scorched by the very fires she lit. But the machinery of cruelty rolled on. Because long before industrial capitalism, debt itself had become a leash that could last generations. The use of debt bondage in many societies. Servitude by ledger. Not all chains are made of iron. Some are made of promises, contracts, and the quiet mathematics of despair. Debt bondage, where a person pledges their labor to repay a loan, was common across ancient and early modern societies, and it was rarely fair, humane, or temporary. In theory, it was simple. You owed money, so you worked it off. In practice, it was a legal trap that passed from parent to child, binding entire families into cycles of servitude that could last decades, sometimes centuries. Debtors could be made to work in mines, fields, or households. In many places, they had fewer rights than slaves, because at least slaves weren't pretending the arrangement was voluntary. Debt bondage appeared in ancient Mesopotamia, classical Greece, feudal India, the Ottoman Empire, you name it. And each society found a way to justify it: religious duty, social order, economic necessity. It turned poverty into a moral failing and labor into a punishment disguised as a contract. Escaping debt bondage often required divine intervention or death. Few got either. And speaking of divine displeasure, the Great Famine of 1317 wasn't caused by war or economics. It was rain, lots of it, enough to make Europe eat itself. The Great Famine of 1317, hunger, rot, and cannibal dreams. In the early 14th century, Europe entered what can only be described as a damp apocalypse. It rained, and kept raining. Crops drowned in their own soil. Grain rotted. Livestock starved. And with it, so did the people. The Great Famine of 1317 wasn't just a food crisis, it was a societal unraveling. Entire villages disappeared. The price of bread skyrocketed. Parents abandoned children. Thieves were executed for stealing onions. Starving peasants dug up graves, boiling corpses in desperate, whispered acts of cannibalism. The government response? Tepid at best. Monarchs offered prayers. Clergy blamed sin. And when divine wrath failed to relent, some towns turned on the usual scapegoats: Jews, heretics, witches, anyone who could explain the inexplicable. The famine hit all levels of society, but as always, the poor died first and most. Disease followed hunger. Lawlessness spread like mold. And the memory of this misery lingered like a fever dream across generations. It was a preview of catastrophe centuries before industrial collapse or climate panic. Just sky, water, and hunger. And just when it seemed Europe couldn't sink lower, thousands of children were led on a doomed pilgrimage that promised salvation and ended in chains. The Children's Crusade. 1212 innocents marched into slavery. In 1212, two movements of children, one in France, one in Germany, rose up with a shared dream: reclaim the Holy Land through purity and faith, rather than swords and steel. They believed that their innocence would part the seas and melt the hearts of Muslim rulers. Spoiler: the seas didn't part. The world, as usual, just swallowed them whole. Thousands of boys and girls, many barely into their teens, abandoned homes and villages to follow charismatic teenage preachers who claimed divine visions. They marched through Europe in rags, singing hymns, surviving on scraps. Some never even made it to the coasting of disease, exposure, or simply disappearing along the way. Those who did reach the Mediterranean found no miracles waiting. Instead, they were duped by slavers, posing as generous Christian merchants. Ships were provided, promises made, and then silence. The children were sold into bondage in North Africa and the Levant, lost in the markets of empire, never to be heard from again. There were no battles, no victories, just naive faith manipulated into profit. The Children's Crusade was not a campaign, it was a harvest. And centuries before this tragedy, another infamous siege ended not in slavery, but mass crucifixion engineered by a man who saw mercy as weakness. The Siege of Tyre, 332 BC. Alexander's wrath by the sea. Tyre was supposed to be impenetrable. A wealthy Phoenician island city with high walls, a formidable navy, and zero interest in surrendering to Alexander the Great, which, unfortunately for them, made it a target that Alexander simply couldn't resist breaking violently and symbolically. The siege lasted 7 brutal months. Alexander ordered the construction of a causeway across the sea to reach the island, dragging rubble, timber, and corpses through knee-deep defiance. When the walls finally fell, what followed wasn't a victory. It was a statement carved into human flesh. 2,000 men were crucified along the shoreline. Not executed in some tidy military fashion, but nailed to wood, left to hang in agony under the Mediterranean sun. The remaining population, women and children, were sold into slavery, parceled out like wartime souvenirs. This wasn't strategy, it was message delivery. Defiance equals spectacle. The same man who spared other cities when they cooperated showed no restraint here, because Tyre had made him wait. And Alexander didn't wait well. And while Tyre's citizens bled in rows of wooden agony, another group in medieval Europe faced a different kind of exile, not through swords or sieges, but with bells tied to their necks and prayers muttered from a safe distance. The persecution of lepers in the Middle Ages, the walking dead of Christendom. To be a leper in medieval Europe was to live a parody of life, a slow-motion exile, where your body decayed while your soul was accused. It wasn't just a disease, it was a verdict. Leprosy, misunderstood and incurable, was treated as both medical blight and divine judgment. You weren't just ill, you were unclean, cursed, spiritually contagious. The response? Forced segregation. Lepers were expelled from towns, stripped of property, and often declared legally dead. In some ceremonies, the church would actually perform a mock funeral for the afflicted, symbolically burying them before the disease did. Those who survived became permanent outcasts, forced to wear special clothing, sometimes with a bell or wooden clapper to alert the healthy of their cursed approach. "Unclean! Unclean!" They were made to shout. They weren't people anymore. They were warnings. Lazar House's isolated leper colonia sprouted across Europe, filled with the groaning, forgotten, and the terminally symbolic. Families severed ties. Compassion became superstition. Faith offered no cure, only separation. And long before Europe learned to burn heretics and witches, she practiced on her lepers socially, spiritually, and sometimes literally. And yet, back in ancient Rome, a far crueler practice awaited not the diseased, but the disobedient decimation. The Roman practice of decimation, discipline by death lottery. Leave it to ancient Rome to invent a punishment that sounds like a math joke and ends in murder. Decimation, from the Latin decimus, meaning 10th, was a disciplinary tactic in the Roman army where 1 in every 10 soldiers in a disgraced unit was executed by their own comrades. Imagine you're part of a legion that broke formation, fled battle, or mutinied. Your commander is furious. Rather than target just the ringleaders, he has the entire unit divided into groups of 10. Each group draws lots. The winner is then clubbed, stabbed, or beaten to death by the other 9. No exceptions, no appeals, no matter how brave you were 5 minutes ago. It was less about eliminating traitors and more about terrorizing the survivors. Decimation left units shattered emotionally and psychologically, but also more obedient, out of pure fear. It wasn't used often, because even Rome knew it was extreme. But when it was, it left a crater in morale that doubled as a warning sign. And while Rome disciplined its soldiers with lethal lottery tickets across the ocean, a different kind of policing was underway this time, against invisible gods, whispered rituals, and the stubborn ghosts of native belief. The suppression of indigenous spiritual beliefs. Inquisition in the New World. After the Spanish conquest of the Americas, indigenous religions didn't just vanish. They went underground, hidden in songs, symbols, and shrines tucked behind altars. But the Catholic Church, ever vigilant and increasingly paranoid, sent in the Inquisition to stamp out what it couldn't absorb. The result? Centuries of spiritual whack-a-mole, enforced with fire, torture, and theological paperwork. Any practice that smelled of the old ways, ritual dancing, prayer to ancestral spirits, herbal medicine, or idol veneration, was labeled heresy. Indigenous people were dragged before tribunals, accused of witchcraft or devil worship. Confessions were extracted with the usual toolkit: isolation, starvation, and the rack. Punishments ranged from public penance to execution. In some areas, entire generations were raised in fear of their own traditions. Priests built churches on top of sacred sites, hoping to erase the memory through architecture. But the memory persisted in secret festivals, in whispered prayers, in flowers left where no one dared ask why. Conversion, it turned out, wasn't just spiritual. It was tactical, violent, and often cosmetic. And while the old gods were being hunted in the New World, family honor was doing the killing elsewhere quietly, but with a blade sharpened by shame. The use of honor killings in many historical cultures. Reputation by blood. In societies where the family name was more valuable than any individual life, honor wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. And when that honor was perceived to be tarnished, especially by women, the solution was often horrifyingly simple: kill the source of shame. Honor killings weren't confined to one culture or time period. Ancient Rome, medieval Europe, South Asia, the Middle East all had variations on the same theme. A daughter seen talking to the wrong man? A wife accused of infidelity? A sister suspected of dishonoring the family with too much autonomy? The result was often execution at the hands of her own kin. These were not crimes of passion. They were sanctioned rituals of social purification, carried out with the approval or at least the silent acceptance of the community. The logic was brutal: better a dead daughter than a dishonored one. What made it especially insidious was how invisible it could be. No trial, no record, just a sudden absence, explained away as misfortune or exile. And while honor demanded blood in private, political power sometimes demanded it on a public stage, with trials scripted, verdicts sealed, and queens condemned by rumor. Just ask Anne Boleyn. The Whispering Campaign against Anne Boleyn, 1536. Lies, lust, and the axe. Anne Boleyn didn't fall from grace. She was shoved with a sword sharpened by gossip and paranoia. In 1536, Henry VIII's second wife went from queen to condemned in the span of weeks, thanks to one of history's most effective smear jobs. The Whispering Campaign, as it's often called, didn't need evidence, it only needed momentum. Accusations of adultery, incest with her brother, treasonous ambition, each one more absurd than the last. But in Henry's court, absurdity was persuasive if it served the king's mood. And Henry, having grown tired of Anne and eager to marry Jane Seymour, was very much in the mood for disposal. The charges were assembled like a stage play. Her alleged lovers, including her own brother George, were rounded up and tortured. Under pressure, at least one confessed. That was enough. Anne was tried by a jury of peers, many of whom owed their titles to the crown's favor, and predictably found guilty. She was executed on Tower Green, beheaded by a French swordsman imported for the occasion. Her only real crime? Failing to bear a male heir and standing between Henry and his next obsession. But while Anne lost her head, countless boys across the Ottoman Empire lost their families, their faith, and their namesal for the Sultan's glory. The Ottoman practice of devshirme, children of Christ, soldiers of Islam. The Ottoman Empire had a recruitment strategy that was equal parts brilliant and horrifying. Devshirme, also known as the child levy. Christian boys from the Balkans were taken from their families by force, by law, or by coercion, and raised as Muslims to serve the empire. It was conversion by abduction, assimilation by design. The process was systematic. Every few years, Ottoman officials swept through Christian villages, selecting the healthiest and most intelligent boys, typically aged 8 to 18. Parents couldn't refuse. Tears and resistance meant nothing. The boys were then marched to Istanbul, converted to Islam, renamed, and trained either for high-level administrative positions or as soldiers in the elite Janissary Corps. Ironically, some of these boys rose to enormous power. As viziers, generals, and guards, they wielded more influence than most Muslims born into the empire. But that doesn't make it less cruel. It was a machine that took identity and fed back loyalty manufactured through loss. The Ottomans framed it as a privilege, a gift, but behind every polished Janissary helmet was a memory of a mother's scream and a name no one dared speak again. And centuries before this, an entire people experienced forced removal on an imperial scale, deported, enslaved, and scattered in a foreign land they would mourn for generations. The Babylonian captivity, 6th century BC, chains, psalms, and the exile of Judah. The Babylonian captivity wasn't just a political move, it was a soul wound carved into an entire civilization. In the 6th century BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the Kingdom of Judah, destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem, and deported thousands of Jewish elites, priests, and artisans to Babylon. This wasn't a raid, it was a strategy. By uprooting the educated and the influential, Babylon sought to break Judah's resistance from within. The poor were left behind to till the land, while the nation's memory bearers were scattered across foreign soil. For decades, they lived in forced exile, enslaved, marginalized, an alien in a city that glittered with ziggurats and gold while their own holy city lay in ruins. The trauma birthed new forms of religious identity, synagogue worship, written scripture, and the idea that God could be portable, not bound to a single temple or land. Songs of lament were written, Psalm 137 among them. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept. The exile ended eventually, but the imprint never faded. It became a template for displacement, resilience, and theological survival. And while Babylon displaced the devout, Rome would elevate its own glory by enslaving thousands to build an aqueduct or die-trying. The construction of the Pont du Gard, 1st century AD. Engineering by exploitation. The Pont du Gard, that elegant Roman aqueduct stretching across the Gardon River in southern France, is often praised as an architectural marvel, which it is graceful arches, precise stonework, and the kind of mathematical precision that would make a modern engineer weep with joy. But behind that symmetry is a less elegant truth. Much of Rome's greatest infrastructure was built on the backs of forced labor. While the Pont du Gard was likely overseen by skilled Roman engineers and artisans, the actual workforce included slaves and conquered locals, toiling under harsh conditions with no credit and even less compensation. These weren't eager volunteers contributing to public works, they were expendable tools in the machine of empire, chipped away like the limestone blocks they hauled. The project's success was Rome's triumph. The cost? Someone else's suffering. The aqueduct brought water to Roman baths and fountains, symbols of leisure and civilization, while the men who built it broke their backs and vanished into history, unnamed. And for all Rome's supposed civility, it wasn't the only empire that fed itself on suffering. In medieval Europe, entire communities were blamed, scapegoated, and slaughtered just for existing in the wrong place, with the wrong faith. The persecution of the Jews, Middle Ages, blood libels, and holy pogroms. For medieval Europe, anti-Semitism wasn't a symptom, it was a system. Throughout the Middle Ages, Jewish communities across the continent lived under constant threat, not just of discrimination, but of violent annihilation. And the justifications? Myth, greed, and a twisted sense of divine duty. The infamous blood libel accused Jews of kidnapping and ritually murdering Christian children to use their blood in religious rites. Completely baseless, utterly insane, and yet widely believed. One rumor could ignite a massacre. One accusation could justify torching a synagogue, looting Jewish homes, and expelling entire communities. Jews were barred from many trades, forced into money lending, then vilified for it. When debts mounted, rulers often found it more convenient to incite pogroms than to repay loans. Entire Jewish quarters were burned. Whole populations were driven out, expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, from Spain in 1492. The pattern was always the same. First suspicion, then extortion, then fire. And still, they endured, studying, praying, surviving an exile. But while Jews were being driven from the pulpit to the pyre, in England even Christian clergy weren't safe if they dared to disobey royal decree. Because in 1662, over 2,000 were cast out in a single sweep. The Great Ejection, 1662, when conscience cost you a church. In post-Restoration England, the monarchy had returned, the Church of England was back in business, and anyone not on board was about to find the door. The Great Ejection of 1662 was a sweeping purge of over 2,000 Puritan ministers who refused to conform to the restored Church's new Book of Common Prayer. This wasn't about heresy. It was about uniformity. Clergy who refused to renounce their dissenting views, who wouldn't swear loyalty to a specific liturgy or take communion the right way, were ejected from their pulpits, their parishes, and their homes. Some lost incomes, others were imprisoned. Many were harassed or banned from preaching altogether. It was a quiet kind of persecution, dressed in legal robes, These ministers weren't dragged to the stake. They were simply unpersoned cut off from their congregations, stripped of their roles, and left to wander in a hostile, religious climate. The ripples lasted for generations. The rift between Anglicans and dissenters deepened. New sects emerged. Some fled to the colonies. Because in a world where faith was currency, being spiritually bankrupt could get you socially executed. And while sermons lost their pulpits in England, land itself was being stolen in Ireland on confiscation at a time. The Irish plantations, 16th, 17th century, colonization by confiscation. Before Ireland became a symbol of resistance, it was a laboratory for colonization. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the English crown launched a series of state-sponsored land seizures known as the plantations. The idea was simple: confiscate land from Irish Catholics, especially those deemed rebellious, and plant it with loyal Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. The effect was less agriculture, more slow-motion ethnic cleansing. Whole families were uprooted, ancient clans reduced to tenants or trespassers in land they had held for generations. New towns were built, often walled and garrisoned, designed to protect the newcomers from the native threat. Cultural suppression followed. Language, religion, legal rights all filtered through the lens of colonial suspicion. The land grabs weren't just economic. They were moralized as divine conquest, with Protestantism standing in for civility and Catholicism recast as barbarism. Resistance was met with military campaigns, starvation, and massacre. The seeds planted during the plantation era would grow into centuries of sectarian tension, rebellion, and bloodshed. It wasn't just territory that was reshaped, it was identity, warped at the root. And while Ireland burned from the inside, Europe was busy refining the public theater of deathware. Fire became the final punctuation for a heretic, a witch, or a traitor. The use of burning at the stake for various crimes. The theater of flames. Burning at the stake wasn't just a punishment, it was a performance. A brutal, fiery exclamation mark at the end of a life judged to be too dangerous for conventional execution. Heresy? Burn them. Witchcraft? Burn them. Treason? Same again. It was the Swiss Army knife of early modern justice. And the worst part? It was done in public. Executions were scheduled like town festivals. People gathered in city squares. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Vendors sold snacks. The condemned were bound to a post, wood stacked around their feet like dry accusation. If they were lucky, they'd be strangled or hanged beforehand. If not, the flames did their work, slowly flesh blackening, skin sloughing, screams rising like incense. It wasn't just about death. It was about deterrence, about making an example of someone so graphically that the crowd would never dream of stepping out of line. The fire was the final sermon. And while clothes turned to ash and lives ended in smoke, elsewhere in Europe, the state controlled what you wore because even your wardrobe had to confess your status. The sumptuary laws, medieval to early modern, fashion policing for the feudal soul. In a time when upward mobility was less aspiration and more heresy, Europe came up with a stylish way to enforce the hierarchy: sumptuary laws. These were legal codes that dictated what people could wear based entirely on their social class. Want to dress like a noble? Better be one. Because that velvet robe or gold trim wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a crime. From England to Italy to France, these laws were absurdly specific. Peasants were forbidden from wearing certain fabrics, colors, or jewelry. Merchants who had made their fortunes were still legally barred from dressing like the aristocracy. Only nobles could wear ermine. Only royalty could wear purple. Heaven forbid a baker's son look too dignified in silk. Next thing you know, he's asking for rights. The rationale? Moral order. The fear was that if everyone dressed alike, the boundaries between classes would blur with it, the divine structure of society. So vanity was legislated, and fashion became an act of subversion. These laws didn't last forever, but the instinct behind them? Very much alive. And, speaking of appearances, in Scotland, a royal witch hunt was less about magic and more about political optics, and it came with smoke, screams, and conveniently timed accusations. The witch hunt of the Scottish Queen, Marie de Guise, 1590. Politics in disguise. In late 16th century Scotland, witches became incredibly useful, especially if you needed to eliminate political enemies or distract the public from inconvenient problems, like crop failures or an unpopular ruler. Enter the witch trials under the regency of Marie de Guise and her not-so-coincidental successor, King James VI, whose obsession with witchcraft would make even Salem blush. The North Berwick witch trials of 1590 were the opening act. Alleged witches, mostly women, but not exclusively, were accused of conspiring with the devil to summon storms that nearly sank James VI's ship during his return from Denmark. A suspiciously nautical origin story for Satan's involvement, but it worked. Torture produced the confessions. Confessions produced more names. And soon, dozens were rounded up, interrogated, and executed, all conveniently at a time when James was consolidating power. Marie de Guise, though long dead by then, had lived through a Scotland already primed for paranoia. Her enemies whispered of Catholic plots, French corruption, and occult leanings. Whether or not she truly instigated witch hunts is debated, but what's clear is that the accusations benefited her successors, especially James, who turned demonology into both hobby and policy. And when slander wasn't enough, Rome had a final punishment: erasure from memory itself. The damnatio memoriae in ancient Rome, erased in stone and mind. The Romans knew how to make a man disappear not just physically but historically. Damnatio memoriae was their ultimate form of posthumous punishment, the systematic erasure of someone from public memory. Names chiseled off monuments, statues defaced or toppled, portraits painted over, deeds unrecorded. The goal? Make it as if they had never existed. This wasn't for common criminals. This was for high-profile disgrace emperors, generals, senators whose crimes or failures had embarrassed the state or the ruling elite. Caligula, Domitian, Geta, all subject to this bureaucratic vanishing act. It wasn't just revenge, it was political sanitation. And yet, the irony is profound. The more Rome tried to erase someone, the more obvious the absence became. Blank spots on monuments, broken inscriptions, historical gaps. The effort to forget created a louder silence. In trying to remove a name, they immortalized the act of removal. Because memory doesn't die with chisels, it adapts. And for the truly unlucky, if you weren't erased, you were paraded humiliated in front of the people you once ruled, then executed with fanfare. The Roman triumph was a victory lap for the conqueror and a death sentence for the conquered. The Roman triumph, glory for one, death for another. Few rituals in ancient Rome matched the spectacle of the triumpha ceremonial parade held for victorious generals who had expanded the empire through conquest and blood. It was celebration, propaganda, and ritual theater all rolled into one. Streets were lined with cheering citizens. Spoils of war were carried aloft. Gold, exotic animals, plundered art. Soldiers chanted. Musicians played. Senators paraded in togas far too clean to have ever seen combat. But at the heart of the spectacle, bound and grim, walked the defeated enemy leader paraded through Rome like a caged beast, soon to be executed in a back room after everyone had their applause. This wasn't just about glory, it was a flex. The Roman people needed to see their enemies broken, not just defeated, but degraded. Meanwhile, a slave stood behind the triumphant general whispering, "Memento mori." Remember, you are mortal. A poetic touch of humility in a performance soaked in humiliation. Rome celebrated its victories by dragging the vanquished behind chariots, publicly, loudly, fatally. And centuries later, another bloody battlefield would open, this time in England, where a crown was up for grabs and children's blood was spilled to keep it out of the wrong hands. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, 1066, victory without survivors. The year 1066 is remembered for the Battle of Hastings, but before that legendary arrow hit Harold Godwinson in the eye, there was Stamford Bridge, a battle so brutal it left more bodies than survivors. Harold had just marched north in record time to confront an invading Norwegian force led by King Harald Hardrada, who was joined by Harold's own traitorous brother, Tostig. Family drama, medieval edition. The English forces caught the Norwegians completely off guard. It was a hot day, and many of them had left their armor on the ships because why not take a leisurely stroll before domination? The ambush turned the riverbank into a charnel pit. One legendary Viking reportedly held the bridge alone for hours, cutting down dozens before being impaled from below by a spear through the slats. Out of over 300 ships that had ferried the Norwegian army to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back home. That's not a defeat, that's obliteration. It was a hard-fought English victory. Short-lived, though, because just weeks later, Harold had to march south to face William of Normandy, and history would famously not be kind. But back in England's own dynastic soap opera, the Wars of the Roses made sure that very few heirs lived long enough to try again. The Wars of the Roses, 15th century. Thrones, thorns, and thinning bloodlines. England's Wars of the Roses weren't just a dynastic struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster. They were a generational meat grinder, disguised as civil war, where battles decided not only who would wear the crown but who lived long enough to breed the next claimant. Every skirmish wasn't just about military victory, it was about erasure. Kill your rival, then kill his children. Take the castle, then raise the nursery. The aim was to eliminate entire bloodlines before they could grow into political headaches, and it worked horrifyingly well. Princes were executed, teenagers were declared traitors, babies vanished from castles in the night. The Tower of London became less a prison and more a forecast model for royal disappearances. When Richard III famously assumed the throne, his nephews, the so-called princes in the Tower, mysteriously disappeared. Spoiler, they didn't run away. By the end of it all, England was so thoroughly exhausted, so genetically thinned, that it welcomed the Tudors like a drunk reaching for water. And while those future monarchs consolidated power with royal decrees, others preferred the more persuasive method, turning bones into confessions with the help of one excruciating invention, the rack. The use of the rack and other torture devices. Truth by tendon. If your idea of justice includes the sound of ligaments snapping, then medieval Europe had just the tool for you. The rack wasn't just a torture device, it was an institution. A skeletal confession extractor made from wood, rope, and the deep belief that the truth could be pulled from a body like thread from cloth. The accused would be tied down by wrists and ankles, then slowly stretched by turning roller-sewn crank at a time. Joints dislocated, muscles tore, tendons snapped. And if the body didn't break, the will usually did. Victims confessed to anything: heresy, witchcraft, conspiracy, murder, whatever you needed. But the rack wasn't the only tool in the sadist's cabinet. There were thumbscrews, iron maidens, real or not, the myth was enough, and the pair of anguish inserted into unfortunate orifices and cranked open like some infernal fruit. The goal wasn't always truth. Sometimes it was silence, or spectacle, or simply the flex of state power. And while pain was turned into legal language, an entire era of English history was about to be rewritten by one king's real estate tantrum, justified with theology and delivered by bulldozing monasteries. The dissolution of the monasteries, 1536, 1541, holy real estate clearance sale. When Henry VIII couldn't get a divorce from the Pope, he didn't just break up with Rome, broke Rome's furniture. looted the house, and sold the silverware. Between 1536 and 1541, under the tidy-sounding policy known as the dissolution of the monasteries, the English crown systematically dismantled over 800 monastic institutions across the country. The official justification? Monasteries were corrupt and spiritually decayed. The real reason? They were filthy rich. And Henry, mid-Reformation and mid-midlife crisis, needed money, land, and the symbolic skull of the Catholic Church to mount on his Protestant mantle. Monks and nuns were turned out, sometimes with pensions, often with nothing. Priceless libraries were scattered or burned, stained glass windows smashed, relics tossed like trash. Manuscripts illuminated with centuries of sacred labor used to wrap fish at the market. Art, gold, and property were seized and redistributed to Henry's loyal nobles, essentially buying aristocratic support with stolen spirituality. England's sacred architecture was gutted, its religious fabric shredded into political coin. But while Henry rebranded himself as the supreme head of the church, across the Atlantic, colonialism was busy exporting English diplomacy to the New World complete, with smiling handshakes and poisoned chalices. The Powhatan Massacre, 1622. Diplomacy with a side of poison. In the early 17th century, relations between English settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia teetered between mutual distrust and desperate cooperation. Food, land, and power were bartered in a tense dance, with peace always one misunderstanding or betrayal away from collapse. Then came 1622. Led by Chief Opechancanough, the Powhatan launched a surprise attack on the English colonists, killing around 350 settlers, roughly a quarter of the population. The goal wasn't total annihilation, but a message: stop expanding, or we'll remove the invitation altogether. The English, shocked and furious, responded with scorched earth vengeance. They raided villages, torched crops, and slaughtered indiscriminately. And in a particularly diplomatic flourish, they invited Powhatan leaders to a peace talk and poisoned the wine. Classic move. About 200 indigenous people died at that friendly gathering. No one raised a glass to that toast except maybe death. The massacre didn't end the colony, but it permanently shifted the tone. No more illusions of coexistence, only walls, muskets, and bitter myths of inevitable dominance. And if that sounds like colonial chaos, just wait until mutinying soldiers in Spain decide they're tired of not getting paid and turn one of Europe's richest cities into a bloodbath. The Spanish Fury of Antwerp, 1576, payday by pillage. It turns out when you don't pay professional killers, they improvise. In 1576, Spanish soldiers stationed in the Low Countries hadn't received their wages in months. The Spanish crown, drowning in debt from constant wars and overextension, shrugged. The soldiers did not. So, they took matters in Antwerp into their own hands. On the 4th of November, the troops mutinied. What followed was a 3-day orgy of looting, arson, and murder, so horrific that it became known simply as the Spanish Fury. Civilians were cut down in the streets, churches and homes were torched. Gold was stolen, women assaulted, children killed. Estimates put the death toll between 7,000 and 10,000. Antwerp, once one of Europe's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan cities, was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Trade collapsed. The city's golden age ended in flames and screams, all because Philip II couldn't balance his checkbook. The massacre shocked Europe. Even loyal Catholic allies began to question whether Spain's Holy Empire was just a mask for economic brutality. It sparked deeper unity among the Dutch provinces and fueled their rebellion. And speaking of rebellion, the peasants of Germany tried it too, though they got fewer loot bags and far more mass graves in return. The Peasants' War in Germany, 1524, 1525, rebellion meets the sword. In theory, the early 16th century should have been a time of spiritual enlightenment. Martin Luther had just nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. The printing press was buzzing, and people were asking bold questions like, "Does God really charge interest?" Unfortunately, the German peasants took that rhetorical spirit a little too literally and paid for it in blood. The Peasants' War was less a single uprising and more a wildfire of rebellion across the Holy Roman Empire. Fueled by crushing feudal taxes, land enclosures, religious hypocrisy, and centuries of resentment, peasants, serfs, and even some townsfolk rose up against their lords with farming tools and homemade banners. They demanded things like fair rents, common land rights, and, audaciously, not being treated like cattle. For a moment, it looked like something might shift, but then Martin Luther, hero of the Reformation, sided with the princes. Why? Because divine order, apparently. He famously urged rulers to smite, slay, and stab the rebels. And they did, brutally. Over 100,000 peasants were slaughtered, villages burned, bodies stacked like warnings. The war ended with little change, except that the lower classes now knew exactly how fast hope could bleed out in a ditch. But even the false promise of holy war couldn't match the horrors of the next one, where children marched to Jerusalem and ended up sold into oblivion. The Children's Crusade, 1212, innocents exploited. Ah, yes. The Children's Crusade, proof that medieval Europe could turn even blind zealotry into child trafficking with just a sprinkle of piety. In 1212, thousands of children, some barely teenagers, others younger, set out from France and Germany with a mission to peacefully reclaim the Holy Land with the purity of their faith. No weapons, no strategy, just a backpack full of bread and dangerous levels of hope. How did this happen? Charismatic preachers, likely children themselves, claimed visions, gathered followers, and convinced mobs of kids that divine winds would part the seas and that conversion not combat would win Jerusalem. The church, conveniently, didn't step in. After all, who wants to crush a little faith-driven mania? The result was predictably catastrophic. Most never made it past the Alps. Those who did were swindled, sold into slavery in North Africa, or died of starvation and exposure. There were no battles, just disappearance. It remains one of the most haunting crusades, not because of its violence, but because of its silence. No great defeats, just a generation erased under the weight of religious fantasy. The Mongol siege of Baghdad, 1258, when the city of wisdom was burned to the ground. Baghdad was once the jewel of the Islamic world, an epicenter of science, poetry, medicine, and philosophy. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and home to the fabled House of Wisdom, where scholars translated and preserved the knowledge of the ancient world. Naturally, the Mongols saw all this flourishing culture and thought, let's see what it looks like on fire. In 1258, Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, laid siege to the city. He promised safety if the Caliph surrendered. The Caliph surrendered. And then Hulagu made good on the Mongol family tradition of no survivors, no libraries. What followed was not war. It was a literary and human genocide. Estimates of the dead range from 100,000 to 1 million, depending on your source and your optimism. Scholars were slaughtered, books were torn from shelves and thrown into the Tigris River. Legend says the water ran black with ink, then red with blood. Either way, Baghdad's cultural light was snuffed out in less than a week. The House of Wisdom? Gone. The Caliph? Rolled into a carpet and trampled by horses, because apparently, Mongols believed spilling royal blood was bad luck. So, they got creative. And just when you think it couldn't get more gruesome, we hop over to Sicily, or a bell tower rang in France bled out in the streets. The Sicilian Vespers, 1282, a massacre set to church bells. The Sicilian Vespers began like a Shakespearean tragedy, with a wedding, a festival, and a foreign occupation everyone hated but couldn't get rid of. It was Easter Monday, 1282. Sicilians gathered outside Palermo for Vespers prayers when a French soldier allegedly molested a local woman. That was the spark. The explosion? A mass uprising so sudden and so surgical, it bordered on operatic revenge. Within hours, the entire French garrison was under attack. By the time the sun rose the next day, thousands of French men, women, and children had been hunted down and butchered. Over the next 6 weeks, somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 French were killed. Not soldiers anyone with the wrong accent. It wasn't just murder, it was methodical. Locals tested suspects by making them pronounce Sicilian words. Get the intonation wrong, and you were dead. Linguistic genocide, brought to you by rage and phonetics. The massacre was fueled by years of resentment under Angevin rule, and it sparked a European power struggle that would drag on for decades. But in Sicily, the message was clear. Occupation has a shelf life and vengeance, a body count. And if you think that's savage, just wait until we start digging up pre-Roman Italy and stumble on evidence of ritual murder dressed in gold leaf. The Etruscan civilizations, pre-Roman. Rituals with a body count. Long before the Romans paved every road in sight and claimed it led back to them, the Etruscans were running the show in central Italy. Mysterious, sophisticated, and often misunderstood, this ancient civilization built cities, forged metal, and created some disturbingly expressive tomb art. And buried within that art sometimes literally are traces of something darker: human sacrifice. Now, the Romans loved to paint the Etruscans as decadent weirdos, but even archaeology seems to agree that ritual killing was on the menu. Graves have been found where individuals, sometimes bound, sometimes placed beneath foundations, appear to have been killed as part of funerary or building rites. What better way to make sure your temple doesn't fall down than by trapping a soul underneath it? Etruscan mythology also hints at a grim theology. Their underworld wasn't a vague concept, it was a violent bureaucracy run by monsters with names like Charon and Tukulcha. Not exactly comforting bedtime stories. And while the Romans eventually absorbed the Etruscans, they made sure to keep the parts they liked, especially the theatrical violence. But next, we head east, to a nomadic culture that didn't just kill their enemies, they drank them. The Scythian practice of ritualistic killings. Blood, bone, and battlefield bragging rights. The Scythians were the kind of nomadic people who made everyone nervous. Roaming the steppes of Central Asia between the 9th and 1st centuries BC, they didn't build cities or cathedrals. They built reputations, terrifying ones. Greek historians like Herodotus described them as fierce warriors with a taste for blood, literally, as in drinking it. These were not shy people. If a Scythian warrior killed an enemy, he'd celebrate not by sending a postcard, but by scalping the corpse, and if he really wanted to impress the neighbors, drinking the dead man's blood. Skulls were sometimes turned into gilded drinking cups. Scalps? Trophies, of course. You weren't just winning a battle, you were decorating your tent with it. And while we can't always trust the Greeks to be unbiased, they were, after all, on the receiving end of a lot of these customs, archaeological finds do show skulls with precise cuts, consistent with ritual defleshing, so not entirely a smear campaign. To the Scythians, death wasn't an ending, it was a currency, and the more brutal your rituals, the more powerful your legend. But brutality wasn't just for nomads. In ancient Athens, tyranny came in embroidered robes, and smiling decrees and dissenters were politely shown the door, or just quietly disappeared. The Athenian tyranny, pre-5th century BC. Democracy's polished prequel. Before Athens invented democracy, and congratulated itself for 2,500 years straight, it had a bit of a strongman phase. Enter the Pisistratid dynasty, particularly Pisistratus and his sons Hipparchus and Hippias, who ruled Athens not with a senate, but with mercenaries, manipulation, and the occasional exile list. Pisistratus was clever. He didn't declare himself king, he called himself a tyrant, which at the time wasn't automatically an insult. It was more like CEO of Athens, minus the shareholder accountability. He staged coups, faked injuries to win sympathy, and once marched into Athens with a tall woman dressed as Athena just to trick people into thinking the goddess approved. 10 points for creativity, 0 for subtlety. Under his rule and his sons, opponents were exiled or executed. Free speech? Sure, as long as it was pro-Pisistratus. The arts flourished, but politics were tightly leashed. After Hipparchus was assassinated in a lover's revenge plot, messy even by Athenian standards, Hippias went full paranoid dictator, ramping up repression until the people finally said, enough. And yet, somehow, this grim little chapter helped lay the foundation for Athenian democracy. Still, as we'll see in the Roman Colosseums, political theater was nothing without a little blood on the sand and maybe a thumb turned down. The gladiatorial games, ancient Rome. Bread, circuses, and casual murder. Gladiators. The ancient world's action heroes, except they didn't get stunt doubles or union benefits. In Rome, public executions weren't just justice. They were a sporting event, complete with sponsors, seating charts, and fan favorites. You didn't just watch someone die, you rated their technique. Most gladiators weren't volunteers. They were prisoners, slaves, or condemned criminals. Trained in special schools and branded with hot irons, they were thrown into combat against animals, other men, or even entire teams. If they fought well, they might earn their freedom. If they didn't, well, audiences loved a good decapitation between lunch and the chariot races. And don't let Hollywood fool you. It wasn't all noble duels and manly honor. Sometimes it was one guy with a net and a trident against 3 guys with swords and a leopard. Sometimes the contest was a full-scale reenactment of a naval battle in a flooded arena with real drowning victims. The crowd loved it. Bread was free. Blood was frequent. And while Rome called it entertainment, it was also distraction, a political sedative with body parts. But in 1492, far from the Colosseums, Spain's final victory wasn't televised. It was quiet, methodical, and soaked in the loss of 2 whole civilizations. The Reconquista in Spain, 1492, the cleansing of a multicultural empire. 1492, the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and also the year Spain flushed out centuries of religious and cultural complexity in a single, iron-fisted sweep. After nearly 800 years of coexistence, competition, and occasional tolerance among Muslims, Jews, and Christians on the Iberian Peninsula, the Catholic monarchs decided the age of multiculturalism was over, permanently. It ended with a victory parade and a checklist. Granada fell. The last Muslim emir was sent packing, reportedly in tears, while his mother, ever supportive, told him to stop crying like a woman for what he couldn't defend like a man. Charming. Then came the convert or leave edicts. Jews were given months to convert to Christianity or else. Thousands left. Others stayed and converted, often under duress. But even the converted weren't safe. The Inquisition was right behind them, sniffing out false Christians with the subtlety of a pack of rabid dogs. Confiscated property, torture, public penance, the works. What had been one of the most intellectually rich and diverse societies in Europe was purged in the name of religious unity and political control. A civilization boiled down to a cross and a crown. And while the Church's hand was heavy in Spain, it was a papal speech in France that set off centuries of holy war, bloodletting, and mass hallucination we now call the Crusades. The Council of Clermont, 1095. Pope. Approved mayhem. If you've ever wondered how to launch a genocidal holy war with great branding, look no further than Pope Urban II's rally cry at the Council of Clermont in 1095. The Church had a problem: too many knights with too much time and a disturbing love of swordplay. Urban had a solution: send them east, tell them God wants it, promise salvation. Let them kill someone other than each other for a change. Urban's sermon was apocalyptic salesmanship. He described the infidels in the Holy Land as baby-eating monsters, and then offered eternal reward for anyone who picked up a cross and marched to Jerusalem. Cue tens of thousands of peasants, nobles, criminals, and opportunists strapping on armor, grabbing pitchforks, and chanting Deus Vult as they poured out of Europe. The First Crusade would become a nightmare of looting, massacres, and massacres of the looted. Entire Jewish communities were wiped out en route. And when they finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, they turned it into a charnel house. Blood literally ran through the streets. It was spiritual hysteria with a kill count, and it would be the first of many. But if you thought Christianity had a rough time in Europe, wait until you see how Japan handled it with hot springs, crosses, and execution squads. The Great Persecution of the Christian Community in Japan, 17th century. Faith under fire. In 17th century Japan, Christianity wasn't just unpopular, it was treason. The Tokugawa shogunate saw European missionaries and their growing band of local converts as a serious threat to national unity, social order, and, perhaps more urgently, control. So they did what authoritarian regimes do best. They eliminated the threat, thoroughly. It began with bans and restrictions. Then came arrests, torture, and public executions. Crucifixions were brought back not as religious homage, but as state-sponsored irony. Converts were paraded through towns, tied to crosses, and speared. Others were tied up and thrown into hot springs until they boiled alive. Some were hung upside down over pits and slowly bled out. The infamous Fumi-e practice forced suspected Christians to step on images of Christ or the Virgin Mary to prove their apostasy. Refuse, and you died. Accept, and you lived technically. By the 1630s, Japan had expelled all foreign missionaries and closed itself off to the world for over 2 centuries. Christianity survived underground, in whispers and secret symbols. The cross didn't disappear, it just went silent. And as for famine, Japan wasn't alone. Across the sea, England was managing its own crisis with policies so rational, people starved to death in plain sight. The Irish potato famine, 17th century, starvation by policy. When most people hear Irish potato famine, they picture the 19th century catastrophe that emptied villages and filled coffin ships. But long before that infamous disaster, the seeds of hunger and of British indifference had already been sown. In the 17th century, Ireland faced multiple crop failures, worsened by one key ingredient: colonial economics dressed up as civilized governance. The English crown viewed Ireland less as a neighbor and more as a resource depot. Land ownership had been systematically transferred from native Irish lords to English and Scottish settlers through the brutal plantation system. Irish Catholics were pushed onto less fertile lands, while the good soyland, the food it produced, was reserved for export. So when the potatoes failed, as they sometimes did, the people had nothing. Nothing, that is, except landlords demanding rent in grain that would be shipped overseas. This wasn't just bad policy. It was policy designed to hurt and justify further conquest when the Irish inevitably rebelled or starved. Starvation wasn't a consequence, it was a message. And as if hunger wasn't cruel enough, the spice trade offered a different flavor of suffering, one where nutmeg was worth more than life, and murder came with a company logo. The Golden Gate Massacre, 1615. Nutmeg and nationalism. In 1615, the Dutch East India Company wanted nutmeg, and the Banda Islands had nutmeg. Unfortunately for the islanders, they also had autonomy. Bad combination. The VOC, as the Dutch like to abbreviate their corporate conquest machine, sent Jan Pieter Joen Quen, a man whose diplomacy style can be described as burn it all, to ensure the Bandanese learned the value of economic compliance. The island of Run became a battlefield of commerce. The Dutch weren't interested in negotiation. They wanted a monopoly. When the locals resisted, Cohen responded with what would be called the Golden Gate Massacre. Dutch forces swept through, slaughtering thousands of islanders. Survivors were enslaved or forcibly relocated. Entire villages were erased. The goal? Total control of the nutmeg trade. Nutmeg, at the time, wasn't just a seasonal baking spice site, was considered medicinal, aphrodisiacal, and wildly profitable. People were literally killed for Christmas flavoring. The Dutch succeeded, temporarily, but the genocide left scars that outlasted any spice market bubble. And while the East Indies bled for flavor, back in England, witches were being marched to the gallows on the strength of gossip, superstition, and very questionable evidence. The Witch Hunt of the Pendle Witches, 1612. Heresy and Hearsay. In the rolling hills of Lancashire, 1612, a group of poor, often marginalized women and a few unfortunate men became the centerpiece of one of England's most infamous witch trials. The Pendle witches weren't particularly magical, unless you count being poor, Catholic, and outspoken as supernatural offenses. At the time, many did. It began with a petty dispute. A peddler refused to sell goods to a woman named Alison Device. Shortly after, he fell ill. Naturally, instead of chalking it up to food poisoning or plague, locals concluded witchcraft. One accusation led to another. Families were torn apart. Children testified against parents. Neighbors settled grudges with pointed fingers and whispered curses. 11 were tried at Lancaster Castle. 10 were hanged. The court accepted evidence ranging from suspicious dolls to second-hand confessions made under duress. No flying broomsticks, no demonic familiars. Just poverty, paranoia, and a justice system that treated spectral evidence like scientific proof. The Pendle trials weren't an anomaly. They were a template. And while England burned witches, the Church across Europe offered heretics a choice: public penance or public agony. Either way, you'd better scream convincingly. The persecution of heretics, medieval. Repent, recant, or roast. In medieval Europe, being wrong about God wasn't just bad for your soul, it was bad for your skin. The persecution of heretics wasn't about idle theological disagreement. It was about control, conformity, and the sweet, smoky smell of burning flesh. The Church knew that if it didn't own the narrative, it might lose its grip. And nothing says divine truth quite like a screaming demonstration in the town square. Heretics, anyone who questioned orthodoxy, translated scripture, skipped mass, or simply annoyed the wrong cleric, were subject to inquisitorial trials. These were less about finding the truth, and more about confirming it had already been decided. Confession was encouraged through methods involving racks, irons, branding, and boredom, so severe you might beg for the tongs. If you confessed, you might be allowed to perform public penance, marching barefoot in the cold, flogging yourself, wearing shame garments with pointy hats. If you didn't confess, well, the stake waited. Either way, your fate was sealed in smoke or stigma. This wasn't rare. It was systemic. From the Cathars in France to the Lollards in England, dissent was met with fire. But while Europe burned the living for their thoughts, ancient Greece had a more straightforward solution: enslave them instead. Slavery in ancient Greece. Democracy for some, chains for others. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, where free men debated justice, virtue, and truth. Just not for everyone. Beneath the polished marble and philosophical salons lay a dirty secret. The whole system ran on slavery. Lots of it. Slaves in ancient Greece weren't racially defined but were typically war captives, debtors, or those simply unlucky enough to be born into bondage. They were domestic servants, minors, teachers, concubines, even police. Yes, Athens had a police force composed entirely of slaves. Because nothing says civic order like outsourcing justice to people without rights. They were legally property, could be beaten, sold, or killed at their master's whim. A slave could buy freedom, but only if they somehow earned money, which often meant renting out their own exploitation. Charming, really. Even the most celebrated minds of the era Plato, Aristotle never seriously questioned the institution. They were too busy inventing ethics while their meals were served by the voiceless. Greek civilization gave us democracy, drama, and geometry, but it also perfected the art of pretending freedom is universal when it clearly wasn't. And centuries later, England took a different approach to managing the poor. Lock them up, starve them, and call it help. The English Poor Laws and Workhouses, 17th century. Compassion, industrial, strength. In 17th century England, poverty wasn't a misfortunite, was a character flaw. The Poor Laws, particularly after the 1601 Act, created a neatly tiered system. The deserving poor, elderly, sick, widowed, got grudging charity, and the undeserving, basically everyone else, got the workhouse, a place where hope went to die of overwork. These weren't shelters. They were punishment facilities with a pious paint job. Families were often separated at the door. Men, women, and children assigned to different sections. The diet was meager. The beds, if you could call them that, were communal. Labor was grueling, breaking rocks, picking oakum, grinding bones for fertilizer. Yes, bones. Workhouses were designed to be worse than the lowest paying job in the free market. The idea was deterrence. If you went there, it meant you had absolutely no other option. And that was the point. It was welfare with a whip. The system would evolve, or metastasize, over the next 2 centuries, but its roots were herein the self-righteous cruelty of an empire discovering that poor people were easier to control when humiliated. But across the border, Scotland was facing a failure not of policy, but of ambition. The price, national bankruptcy, and a colony full of corpses. The starvation of the Scots, 17th century. Empire by pipe dream, death by swamp. In the late 1690s, Scotland had a plan. A big one. Tired of being England's scrappy, overshadowed neighbor, they figured it was time to launch their own global empire. The solution? Colonize a tiny strip of mosquito-infested jungle in Panama, cut a trade route through the isthmus, and become the commercial heart of the world. They called it the Darien Scheme. The locals just called it hell. Back home, patriotic fever swept through the land. Everyone invested. Nobles, merchants, farmer, 7 poor families scraped together what they could. 1/5 of all the money in Scotland was funneled into this bold fantasy. 5 ships and 1,200 settlers set sail in 1698. What they found was not El Dorado. It was rain, disease, and quicksand. The heat was unbearable. The supplies ran out. The indigenous people wanted nothing to do with them, and the Spanish who already claimed the region were sharpening their swords nearby. Malaria, dysentery, starvation, death came fast and without fanfare. Of the initial settlers, barely a few hundred survived. A second wave arrived and died the same way. The financial ruin back in Scotland was total. The national economy collapsed. It would take only a few more years before the country, broken and bankrupt, agreed to political union with England. Thus, the United Kingdom was born not from shared ideals, but from imperial face-planting and mass graves in the tropics. And so ends our descent through forgotten footnotes, sanitized textbooks, and the bloody scaffolding of history. These weren't accidents or anomalies, they were patterns. Beautifully rationalized, conveniently erased. Because beneath every golden age, there's a mass grave someone paid not to look at. Sleep well.